Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a palace that has not yet become yours, into a world where the Nile is a slow, dark ribbon outside, and the walls around you smell of cool stone and oil lamps. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the comments, if you feel like sharing, you can whisper where you are listening from tonight and what time the clock or the phone beside your bed is showing. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin not as a queen, not yet, but as a child of a noble household somewhere along the broad river that feeds all of Egypt. Outside your family villa, fields lie in neat rectangles cut by irrigation channels, small mirrors of water shining in the early sun, while beyond them the desert rises, pale and empty, watching the narrow strip of green. You wake to sounds that will always mean home. The creak of water wheels lifting Nile water, the lowing of cattle, the slap of wet clay in a potter's hands, and, closer, the soft bustle of servants preparing bread from emmer wheat. In this world, the pharaoh already exists in your mind as a distant, blazing figure, a living Horus whose name is carved into cartouches on temple walls in cities like Thebes. Priests speak of him in terms of Ma'at, that careful balance of order and justice that keeps the sun crossing the sky and the river rising in its season. And even as a small girl, you feel that your own life is a thin thread woven somewhere inside that vast pattern. Within your father's house, you move through airy but shaded rooms, whitewashed walls painted with lotus flowers and marsh birds, ceiling beams dotted with stars to echo the night sky overhead. You learn early how to walk lightly over cool stone floors, bare feet quiet, linen dress brushing your shins, a small pendant at your throat, warming slowly against your skin as the day grows hotter. Women in your household, your mother, older aunts, trusted servants, show you things that are never written on papyrus, but matter as much as any law. How long to hold someone's gaze, and when to lower your eyes, when to let laughter rise, and when to smooth it away. How to hear the request hidden inside a pleasant phrase. You learn which visitor is truly powerful, not from the jewelry he wears, but from the way others adjust their posture when he enters a room. You learn that sometimes silence is safer than agreement, and that forgetting to notice something can be as deliberate as noticing it. Sometimes you sit with a scribe hired to teach the children of the house, learning the flowing signs of hieratic script on smooth wooden boards. Not every noble girl is taught to write, but in some New Kingdom families, where administration and temple accounts are everything, daughters are trained enough to read letters and understand simple records. As your hand tries to imitate the scribe's steady strokes, you hear him murmur dates and names. The regnal year of the king, the great festival of Opet, when statues travel by boat from Karnak to Luxor, the count of cattle and grain owed as tax. You do not yet know that one day, such numbers and festivals will shape the air you breathe. Your days are measured not only in lessons, but in small rituals of comfort and beauty. In the mornings, a servant arranges your hair into braids, sometimes adding perfumed fats that soften in the heat and release fragrance, a custom that makes feasts and important visits smell of blue lotus and myrrh. Around your wrists and ankles, bracelets of faience or gold clink softly as you walk, a musical reminder of your status and of the expectations that come with it. When the Nile floods, your household gives thanks with offerings at a local temple, the air thick with incense and low-voiced hymns. You feel the cool flagstones under your feet and tilt your face up toward colossal statues of gods, their expressions calm and remote, as though they have watched this same cycle thousands of times and will watch it thousands more. Somewhere near the sanctuary, a small household priest from your estate speaks quietly with a temple official about dues and gifts, and even though you are only a child, you understand that devotion and obligation travel together like two boats tied to the same mooring. From time to time, your father returns from the capital, bringing news of the court, a new campaign in Kush, a delegation from a far land, a temple gateway being raised at Karnak, with tall columns like bundled reeds. His stories are part politics, part wonder, and when he describes the pharaoh in his chariot, crown gleaming, bow drawn against enemies carved forever as shrinking prisoners on temple walls. You sense that your small world of courtyards and gardens is linked to something immense and dangerous. At dinners, when important visitors come, you are sometimes allowed to sit quietly at the edge of the room, a polite shadow. You listen as men discuss grain shipments, labor for royal building projects, the reliability of scribes, and the moods of powerful priests of Amun. Their words are thick with courtesy, but beneath them you start to hear another current. Worries about poor floods and empty granaries, about foreign powers testing Egypt's borders, about what might happen when this pharaoh dies and another must take the throne. You do not follow every detail, but you understand their caution, the way each phrase is chosen as carefully as a stone set in a wall. Even as a child, you notice which names are spoken with warmth and which are said more softly, with the sort of care that suggests the walls themselves might be listening. Somewhere inside you, a small awareness settles. In Egypt, words can be as heavy as building blocks of limestone, and choosing them well can mean safety. The rhythm of your life follows the river, the seasons, and the quiet discipline of rank. There are days of play in a shaded garden where figs ripen and a small pool reflects a square of sky, fish flickering just below the surface. There are days of strict practice, when a misstep in manners earns a sharp look from your mother, reminding you that your behavior reflects not just on you, but on your whole house. On quieter afternoons, you sit near an open doorway and watch servants at their tasks, weaving linen on tall looms, grinding grain on stone querns, washing clothes by the water's edge. You absorb the cadence of their chatter, the way they slip from gossip to prayer to complaint and back again, and you begin to understand that the kingdom is not only made of kings and generals and priests, but of these ordinary, tireless movements. Centuries later, historians will speak cautiously about the daily life of noble girls like you, knowing that the evidence is uneven, filtered through tomb scenes, legal texts, and records written by those who thought most about ideals. Some will argue that a girl in your position is largely ornamental, existing mainly to be married off as part of a political bargain. Others will point to deeds and titles that show elite women owning property, managing estates, and commissioning their own monuments. The truth of your days probably lies somewhere between those views, in the half-lit spaces of influence that leave few clear traces on stone. You, lying on your rush mat at night and listening to frogs by the irrigation channels, do not think in those terms. You think of the painted shapes on your bedroom walls, of the faint smell of incense left on your clothes after temple visits, of the distant idea of a king whose name everyone speaks with careful respect. Day after day, you are told, in 100 gentle ways, that you are part of a story much larger than yourself. For now, that story is contained within this noble house, by the Nile, the painted rooms, the shaded pool, the sycamore fig tree, where you sometimes sit with a handmaid and listen to her low, lilting songs. Yet already, without your knowing, your name has begun to move through other rooms, on other tongues, in conversations you are not invited to hear. The river outside keeps flowing north to the sea, bearing boats laden with grain and gold and letters, and somewhere upstream, in a palace whose columns you have never seen, a king's household is considering the future. One day, they will look in your direction, so when the royal envoy finally arrives at your family estate, it feels less like a surprise and more like a distant storm at last, reaching the bend in the river where you live. You do not see the first dust of his approach. You notice instead the way the household changes before he even steps through the gate. Servants scrub the courtyard flagstones twice over. Fresh reeds are laid down where important sandals will tread. The best linen is brought out from chests and shaken in the pale morning light, and your mother inspects every hem as if the fabric itself will be questioned. Your father's steward checks lists of cattle and jars of grain, calculating what can be offered without damaging the estate's reserves. You, still technically a girl and not yet a fully grown woman, are told to sit with your mother and remain very quiet. There is no need to explain who is coming. The message arrived days ago, bearing not a name but a title: servant of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the two lands. It was enough. When the envoy's chariot finally rattles up from the river track, sunlight flashes off bronze fittings and polished horse harness. Behind him, a small entourage carries wooden chests sealed with clay and the king's name impressed in the damp surface. The sight of that cartouche, loop and line enclosing the royal titles, makes even the most self-assured elders in your house bow a little lower. You watch from a shaded doorway as greetings are exchanged in careful phrases, your father's words heavy with respect, the envoy's voice smooth and impersonal, as if he has delivered this same speech at many doors along the Nile. Somewhere inside his formal sentences is the heart of the matter. The palace is seeking new women for the royal household, not merely entertainers or servants in the vast women's quarters, but wives of good birth, whose families are loyal and whose presence at court can bind important networks more tightly to the throne. The idea that this might involve you has been hovering at the edges of conversation for months, like a bird that will not quite land. You have overheard your mother talking in low tones about other girls of your rank who have gone to Thebes or Pyrameses, never to return permanently, except perhaps in deity-adorned tomb scenes. You have seen your father reread letters from officials whose titles seem to grow longer each year. Now, the bird lands. You are called into the reception room when the time is right, after the envoy has been given cool water and perfumed oil, after offerings have been made to the small household shrine, so that the gods, too, are witnesses. The room feels different instantly. The walls are still the same painted marshes and birds, but every eye inside is watching you, measuring your walk, your posture, even the angle of your chin as you bow. You stand beside your mother, linen dress perfectly clean, hair braided and smoothed with scented unguent that releases a faint floral warmth in the still air. The envoy's gaze is polite, professional. He is not here to see you as a person so much as to assess whether you can become part of a pattern the palace is designing. Even so, he notices the steadiness of your eyes, the ease with which you answer simple questions about your household gods, your ability to recite a formal blessing for the king. Questions are asked around you, as if you are a delicate object being weighed, about your health, about your education, about any previous formal promises of marriage. Your father and mother reply with care. They speak of your upbringing, of your learning in music and household management, perhaps of your familiarity with basic reading, something that, in certain New Kingdom circles, is a quiet advantage rather than a necessity. Not every noble daughter in Egypt will be considered for such a match. Some will marry local officials, priests, or army officers, strengthening ties within a region or a temple. Others will remain closer to home, managing estates or property they themselves own, a reality testified to in surviving legal texts, where women appear as landowners and litigants in their own right. Historians centuries later will debate how common these paths were, but the papyri that do survive make clear that wealthy Egyptian women could be more than passive ornaments. In your case, the path being discussed is narrower, higher, and far more exposed. Your marriage would be to the palace itself, to the complicated, expanding institution that surrounds the king. Whether you become one of several wives, or, if favor and politics align, a particularly prominent one, your life will be rewoven into the fabric of royal expectation. Before any answer is given, there must be signs. Egyptian life, especially at this elite level, rarely moves forward on human will alone. Your family priest consults omens, not in the way that neighbors on the riverbank might talk about ill-placed birds, but through more formal channels. At the local temple, questions are murmured in the presence of a god's statue, perhaps carried on a small, portable shrine. In some periods, such statues are believed to give yes or no answers, their bearers, feeling for a slight forward or backward motion, interpreted as divine will. Dreams, too, are noted. Your mother remembers a vision of the goddess Hathor, patroness of love and music, and women's roles, offering a mirror. Is it a sign? People in your world often think so, though modern scholars, looking back, will argue about how literally such stories were taken at the time. They will parse the difference between literary motifs and real practice, and they will remind one another that an ancient text is not the same as a diary. For you, The distinctions between symbol and life are less important than the quiet conversations that follow. You hear your parents speak at night behind a half-closed door, their voices low and tight. This match would bring honor, yes, and protection, and perhaps a share in royal favor that could shelter your brothers' careers and your family's estates. But it would also mean letting you go into a world where mistakes can be dangerous, where favor can sour quickly, and where the line between domestic intimacy and public policy is thin. In the days that follow, negotiations take the form of polite letters and verbal assurances. The envoy meets your father again, this time with more detail. The level of your support at court, the servants you may bring, the dowry that will accompany you. Marriage contracts in Egypt can be surprisingly specific, listing property, obligations, and protections. Although surviving examples come mostly from non-royal settings, they suggest a broader legal culture in which a woman's rights within marriage are recognized, at least on papyrus. Whether the full strength of those protections reaches the depths of the palace is another question, one that later historians will approach with caution. Slowly, a shape of the future emerges. You will be sent to the royal residence, perhaps the palatial city on the west bank at Thebes, whose walls rise behind the great temples of Amun, or perhaps to a northern capital in the delta, where the king spends more of his time. You will be presented not directly to the pharaoh at first, but to senior women and administrators in the royal household, who will place you where they deem best. On the day your family finally agrees, there is no great explosion of joy, no dancing in the courtyard. Instead, there is a formal offering in the household chapel, incense rising in slow curls before a small image of a god. Your mother's hand rests on your shoulder a little longer than usual, fingers digging in just enough that you feel both pride and fear. You spend these last days at home moving through familiar spaces with a new awareness. The pool where you once watched fish beneath water lilies seems smaller now, a pond in a private world about to be exchanged for vast palace basins reflecting columned facades. The quiet domestic shrine where you have prayed will be replaced by grander chapels, but also by the knowledge that in the royal household, religious devotion is inseparable from political display. At night, you lie awake and listen to the sounds of the estate. Distant laughter from servants' quarters, the steady creak of a water wheel lifting Nile water for the fields, the occasional bark of a dog chasing something in the dark. You try to imagine the sounds that will replace these. The echo of sandals on polished stone corridors, the constant murmuring of many women in shared chambers, the drums and trumpets of royal ceremonies. You are not asked directly whether you wish this future. In your world, a noble daughter's choice is shaped more by expectation and duty than by personal desire. Later scholars, reading between lines of tomb inscriptions and letters, will debate just how much agency someone like you possessed, whether you could refuse or negotiate or influence the terms of your life in subtle ways. Perhaps the answer, again, lies not in extremes, but in the small, stubborn spaces people always carve out inside larger systems. For now, you stand at the edge of your family garden as the sun sets in a wash of red over the western desert, the land of the dead. Beyond that horizon lies the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs are laid to rest. Beyond it, in your imagination, is a life you cannot yet picture clearly. The envoy's chariot waits in the near future. The river will carry you north or south, and the house of the pharaoh is already adjusting itself to receive you, like a great set of doors slowly, inevitably opening. The day you leave your family estate, the river looks the same as it always has, but it feels different under your eyes. The Nile that once framed your childhood has become the road to another life. You step into the royal boat not as a guest, but as someone being carried toward a permanent destination, like a precious object wrapped in layers of linen and ceremony. The vessel itself is larger and finer than anything your household owns. Its prow curls upward in a graceful arc, painted and inlaid, and the deck smells of resin and fresh-cut wood. Sailors move with practiced ease, bare backs shining in the sun as they adjust ropes and the broad square sail, watching for the right wind. The envoy's men stand or sit near the bow, their posture casual, but their eyes always scanning, as if every stretch of riverbank might hold something that is their concern. You sit beneath a canopy to shield you from the glare, linen veil over your hair, jewelry chosen carefully to show both modesty and status. Beside you, a servant fans away flies with a palm frond. Another keeps a small jar of scented oil ready, a thin line between comfort and the nausea that can come with long hours on moving water. The boat pushes off. The estate recedes, your father's figure shrinking on the riverbank, hand raised in a gesture that is blessing, farewell, and surrender all at once. The familiar patchwork of fields slides sideways as the current and sail draw you along. Palms and sycamores glide past, and beyond them the golden strip of desert waits, unchanged and unconcerned. Days on the river settle into a pattern. The Nile in this new kingdom age is a busy highway. You pass barges heavy with grain for royal storehouses, boats laden with limestone from quarries, smaller craft carrying fishermen, officials, and families. Sometimes you share the water with troop transports, soldiers packed together under the sun, their shields stacked like overlapping scales. At major stops, the boat pulls in to take on fresh supplies. You glimpse local temples, their pylons decorated with scenes of the king smiting enemies, or making offerings to Amun, Ra, or Ptah. You hear snatches of news in the murmurs of dock workers and officials. A fortress being reinforced near the frontier, a new statue dedicated at Karnak, a caravan due from Syria with exotic timber and copper. Each story reminds you that the palace you are approaching is not an isolated island of luxury, but the knot at the center of these lines. The rivers of grain, the caravans of goods, the chains of command that hold armies together. Somewhere at the end of this journey, the man who personifies all of it will live, eat, and sleep, surrounded by walls you have not yet seen. When at last the royal residence comes into view, it does not appear all at once. First, you notice more boats painted in bright colors, with official standards fluttering at their sterns. Then you see the full width of the river lined with docks, storage facilities, boatyards. Beyond them, the skyline rises. Temple pylons like immense gateways, obelisks piercing the sky, and, nearer the river, palatial structures with flat roofs and colonnaded facades. If you are brought to Thebes in the south, the palaces spread along the west bank, near estates, such as the one modern scholars call Malkata, where Amenhotep III once built a vast residence with painted floors showing marshes and birds. If instead your king favors a delta capital like Pi-Ramesses in the north, the air will feel more humid, the water channels more intricate, the buildings interlaced with canals. The names and exact layouts may differ, and archaeologists thousands of years later will argue over which surviving mud brick ruins belong to which royal house. But to you, the impression is the same: size, complexity, and a sense that everything here has been designed to radiate from the king. You disembark under watchful eyes. A formal greeting party meets you, scribes with palettes of black and red ink tucked under their arms, officials in clean linen kilts, guards with short swords, and those distinctive blue helmets seen in reliefs of palace guards. They check lists on rolls of papyrus to make sure every item of your entourage, every chest and servant, matches what was promised. The gate you pass through may resemble those known from Ramesside palaces, a kind of migdol structure with towers flanking a central doorway, inspired by fortress architecture. Above it, painted scenes show the king triumphant over foreign lands, captives bound in neat rows, the chaos outside Egypt's borders made small and orderly on the plastered wall. You step underneath these images, aware that your own life is now part of the order they claim to represent. Inside, the temperature drops slightly as cool air gathers in shaded courts and pillared halls. The floors beneath your feet are smoother than the stone at home, sometimes overlaid with gypsum plaster and paint. In some rooms, artists have turned the surface underfoot into illusions. Pools full of fish, lotus blossoms, and birds, so that when you walk, it feels as if you move through a garden and a river at once. Archaeologists centuries later will find fragments of these painted floors and tiles and reconstruct them in museums, debating whether the scenes were meant to be purely decorative or symbolic echoes of the cosmos as Egyptians understood it. Corridors lead into courtyards, courtyards into halls, halls into more enclosed clusters of rooms. The palace is not just one grand building, but a whole quarter of the city, with storage magazines, workshops, scribal offices, gardens, and the separate complex where the king receives foreign envoys and appears before his people at a window of appearances. You will not see all of this at once. The palace reveals itself like a long story, with careful pacing. For now, you are taken into the part that will be your world. The women's quarters and the apartments associated with them. The term that modern languages translate as harem can be misleading, loaded with later fantasies. In your time, this house of the royal children, or Perkenti, is a highly organized institution. It includes wives, concubines, their attendants, children, tutors, and the staff needed to support them. There are storerooms for textiles and cosmetics, offices where administrators track rations and gifts, and shrines where women can honor deities like Hathor and Tauret, protectors of love and childbirth. You notice at once that you are not alone in being foreign to this place. Around you, women and girls speak Egyptian in different accents, and in some corners, you hear other languages, the echoes of alliances with Mitanni, Hatti, and Babylon, where royal daughters are sometimes sent to Egypt as part of diplomatic marriages. Archaeological finds from places thought to be harem towns, like Gurub, near the Fayum, include objects bearing foreign names and styles of dress, supporting the idea that these compounds housed a mixture of Egyptian and non-Egyptian women linked to the royal household. You are led through a large courtyard where palm trees cast patterned shade on the ground, and then into a reception room where senior women of the palace wait. They wear fine linen so sheer it catches the light, heavy wigs scented with perfume, and broad collars of faience and semi-precious stones that turn their chests into crescents of blue, green, and gold. Their eyes, outlined with kohl, are keen. They represent a hierarchy that is not immediately obvious to an outsider. Some are great royal wives, bearing titles that pair their names closely with the king's. Others are secondary wives, concubines favored or forgotten, and women related to high officials and priests. You sense it in subtle differences. The quality of their jewelry, who speaks first, who is listened to longest, who stands just a little nearer the center of the room. You bow and offer prepared phrases of respect, your voice steady even as your pulse quickens. A woman whose titles include references to the gods, perhaps singer of a moon or god's wife, depending on the period, steps forward to greet you. She assesses you much as the envoy did, not only as a person, but as a piece in a careful arrangement of loyalties. Arrangements are made without your full understanding. You are assigned rooms, servants, and an older attendant who will guide you through the first bewildering days. Your personal possessions are inventoried and placed in storage or in your new quarters, with scribes noting each item. You are shown a small plastered chamber with a bed frame made of wood and woven straps, a stand for a headrest, and a niche for household gods. It is simpler than some fantasies of royal luxury, but cleaner, more ordered, and more guarded than most homes in Egypt could ever be. From the narrow window, if there is one, you catch a glimpse of the palace gardens, straight paths lined with trees, rectangular ponds where lotus flowers spread and ducks swim, pavilions where music will sound during festivals. Somewhere beyond those trees, the king moves through his own series of rooms, joined to yours not by shared air and scent, but by corridors of influence and protocol you have yet to learn. Later scholars will piece together this world from broken walls, administrative texts, and idealized tomb scenes, arguing over how strictly the women's quarters were separated from the rest of the palace, and how much freedom individuals like you had to move, to influence, to act. Some will imagine harem women as deeply secluded. Others will point to evidence of royal wives owning property, commissioning monuments, and appearing in public ritual. As with so much of Egypt, the reality probably lies in layers, public faces, and private negotiations, restriction and agency intertwined. For you, in these first hours, the debate is distant. You feel only the strangeness of new walls, new voices, and the awareness that your childhood has ended somewhere back along the river behind you. Ahead, lies a complicated dance of etiquette and survival. Tonight, though, your head will rest on a wooden support in this newly assigned bed, and the sounds that lull you to sleep will be the rustle of many women settling on mats and beds nearby, the distant call of palace guards changing watch, and, faintly, the soft lap of Nile water against the royal docks outside the palace gates. In the first days, the palace feels like a maze of stone and painted plaster. But soon, another kind of labyrinth begins to unfold. The rules that govern every glance, every word, every silence. You wake before dawn to the muffled noises of the household stirring, and as the sky over the Nile turns from deep indigo to pale gold, your education in this new world quietly begins. An older woman, assigned as your attendant and guide, comes to your chamber with a small oil lamp and a basin of cool water. She is not of royal birth, but she has lived within these walls for many years, and experience has become its own kind of rank. As you wash, she talks not in the formal tones of a tutor, but in the low, steady voice of someone passing on survival skills. She explains that in this palace, words are never just air. They are tools, offerings, weapons. When you greet a superior, your hands must be placed just so, your head inclined to the right depth, not too shallow, not abject. When you speak the king's names, you do not rush them. You let each title rest on your tongue like a small offering. When you speak to those beneath you in rank, you are firm but not careless. Harshness travels quickly and can make enemies you do not yet realize you have. Later, more formal instruction starts. A scribe is assigned to teach you the finer points of language and etiquette. He carries his palette of black and red ink, his reed pens, and rolls of papyrus or wooden tablets. You already know how to read some hieratic signs from your childhood lessons, but here the focus is different. You are taught the formulaic phrases used in letters to high officials, the correct blessings to send with gifts, the subtle distinctions between terms that indicate simple respect and those that suggest deep loyalty. He shows you sample letters not from royal wives, whose private correspondence has rarely survived, but from other elites who must write to the throne and its representatives. The phrases repeat like patterns on a woven cloth. May Amun give life, prosperity, and health to my lord. I am the servant of the palace, the dust under your sandals. You practice the lines until they feel natural, understanding that someday your voice may be carried in such words, even if someone else's hand writes them. You are also introduced to wisdom literature, the instructions that Egyptian elites copy and recopy over generations. Teachings about how to behave at banquets, how to answer superiors, how to listen more than you speak, whether you read them yourself or have them recited to you. Their advice fits the world you now inhabit with unsettling precision. They warn against greed, against drunkenness, in the presence of one's betters, against gossip, a danger that feels very real in these close-packed women's quarters, where stories travel faster than a boat in a good north wind. In the afternoons, you sit with a group of women in a small shaded hall, where the walls are painted with marsh scenes and offering tables. A senior great royal wife, or one of her closest attendants, uses this space as a schoolroom of sorts for new arrivals. She does not speak in abstract terms about virtue or honor. Instead, she recounts small, concrete incidents. A wife who spoke too freely about a prince's shortcomings and found herself abruptly moved to less favorable rooms. A visitor who failed to praise a particular statue of the king and was later ignored when she tried to request a favor. A minor official whose careless joke about a temple quickly became a note in a scribe's report. These are not formal laws carved on stone. They are unwritten regulations enforced by memory and perception. You learn that in this palace, people remember not only what you say, but when you say it, and in whose presence. The senior woman's voice is gentle, but the examples she chooses make a simple point. Survival here means paying attention. Your training also extends to ritual. Because the king is seen as the earthly embodiment of divine order, the presence of his wives in religious ceremonies has political weight. You are taught how to stand beside him, or, at first, behind more senior women during processions to the great temples. If you are in Thebes, This might include the grand festival of Opet, when the Barque of Amun is carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple. You rehearse the careful choreography of approaching a shrine, of lifting a sistrum in your hand and shaking it with measured grace, of offering a bouquet of lotus flowers without turning your back on the divine image. In small palace chapels, you practice hymns to Hathor and to other goddesses associated with music, beauty, and fertility. Some of the women around you hold titles like Chantress of Amun, linking them both to the temple and the court. You learn that music can be more than entertainment. It is a way of stitching together devotion and influence. A well-chosen song, offered at the right moment, can make a queen seem especially dear to a god, and, by extension, to the king, who is always watching for signs of divine favor. Beyond ritual and speech, there is the language of movement and stillness. You discover that walking across a courtyard is never simply crossing space. If you pause to greet a particular attendant, others will notice. If you choose to sit beside one wife rather than another at a shared meal, it sends a quiet signal. Even the way you accept or refuse a cup of wine at an evening gathering can be read as commentary on the mood of the day. Your attendant continues to whisper small bits of advice as she dresses you. Which colors of linen are most appropriately modest for a given festival, when to wear heavier jewelry, and when to let your throat and wrists remain almost bare. In some periods, older conventions favor more substantial, opaque garments. In others, fashion leans towards sheer layers that reveal the body's outline beneath. The palace adopts and sets these trends, and you must follow them without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Too plain, and you seem ungrateful. Too elaborate, and you risk being seen as vain or vying for notice. Historians peering back through the centuries will do their best to reconstruct the education of women like you. But the evidence is scattered. They will extrapolate from titles carved in tombs, mistress of the house, great royal wife, God's wife of Amun, and from scenes showing royal women at banquets and rituals. Some will argue that your training is mostly ornamental, focused on music, dress, and the ability to stand beautifully at the king's side. Others will suggest that, given the complexity of the palace, you must also learn at least the outlines of estate management, legal matters, and diplomatic etiquette. The debate will likely never be fully resolved, because the papyri that would answer the question directly have not survived, or were never written in the first place. What you know, moving through these echoing rooms day after day, is that your lessons are slowly changing the way you see. You begin to notice how a scribe's small change in tone signals that a message from the army contains bad news. You recognize when a steward's nervousness at a grain report means that taxes will be harder to collect downriver, which in turn might mean more grumbling in villages you will never visit. You can tell, from the set of a senior wife's shoulders as she returns from an audience with the king, whether she has been pleased or disappointed. In quiet moments, sitting by a lattice window and watching the shadows of palm fronds shift across the courtyard floor, you realize that you are learning more than how to survive in a hierarchy. You are learning how power feels, how it moves through a building, how it changes the air before anyone speaks. That knowledge will not be written on your tomb walls, but it seeps into you all the same, as persistent as the Nile's flood. At night, when you lie down on your bed with its woven straps and linen sheets, the palace no longer feels quite so strange. The sounds on the other side of your door, soft footsteps, distant music, a murmur of voices, have begun to arrange themselves into familiar patterns. You understand a little better which patterns are safe and which hint at storms gathering just beyond your sight. You are still new here, still adjusting, but with each careful word and measured gesture, you are weaving yourself more tightly into the palace's invisible web, learning to smile with your lips, while your mind quietly reads every current in the room. By the time the rhythms of etiquette begin to feel familiar, the women's house itself starts to unfold around you like a living, breathing city within the palace. You wake one morning to the sound of laughter in the corridor and realize that, in this part of the royal complex, the most important world is not beyond the walls, but just beyond your door. Stepping out, you pass rows of chambers like your own, some simple, some slightly larger, their thresholds marked by small differences. A painted symbol here, a finer curtain there, more or fewer servants moving in and out. This is the house of the royal children, the women's quarters, the place that later generations will nickname the harem, a word that carries its own set of fantasies. In your time, it is more prosaic and more complicated. A cluster of living spaces, storerooms, small gardens, schoolrooms, and shrines, all stitched together by narrow hallways and shared routines. You move through a courtyard where linen hangs to dry, fluttering like pale sails against the blue sky. Women sit on low stools, grinding grain or combing one another's hair, their fingers moving with automatic skill. Children chase each other between the shadows of columns, their bare feet slapping softly on the floor, their laughter mixing with the steady scrape of grinding stones and the splash of water being poured from jar to jar. Not everyone here is a king's wife. There are great royal wives, bearing titles carved on temple walls, secondary wives, whose names may never make it onto stone, but who nonetheless live close enough to the king to bear his children, concubines of various statuses, and women connected to important officials, priests, and foreign courts. There are also female servants and administrators, wet nurses, musicians, and dancers, whose presence turns this space into a dense, layered community. Your own position sits somewhere within this hierarchy, shaped by your birth, your family's importance, and any favor you might eventually gain. On the surface, you share daily life with everyone else. You eat from communal platters, bathe in shared facilities, and participate in group rituals. You sit on woven mats to chat with the same cluster of women most afternoons, stitching or playing the ancient board game Senet while the sun slants across the courtyard. But beneath those shared activities, currents run. Some of the women you meet on these mats will become genuine friends. One might be a princess from a foreign land, married to the pharaoh as a diplomatic link to her father's kingdom, her Egyptian still flavored with the patterns of another tongue. Another might be a distant cousin of the king, raised with a sense of entitlement that shows in the tilt of her chin. A third might be the daughter of a general or high priest, her place here a sign of her family's closeness to the throne. With them, you learn to share stories in pieces. You talk about your childhood homes, the taste of bread in different parts of Egypt, the colors of desert and sky you remember best. You exchange gossip about minor officials, about which steward forgot to deliver enough oil rations last month, about which musician is rumored to have caught the king's eye for a brief moment. In these conversations, alliances form almost without planning. You gravitate toward those whose humor matches yours, whose envy is mild rather than corrosive, whose ambitions seem compatible with your own survival. And yet, rivalry is never far away. When a new gift arrives from the king, perhaps jars of perfumed oil, lengths of fine linen, or a set of inlaid furniture, everyone notices who receives what. The distribution is not random. It reflects current favor, family leverage, and the king's shifting attention. A slightly larger share of scented unguent sent to one woman can spark days of whispers. A new necklace given to another can mark her as temporarily ascendant in the subtle contest for visibility. You learn to react carefully. If a woman you hope to befriend receives elaborate gifts, you offer congratulations that are warm but not effusive, while quietly noting how others respond. If someone else's portion is noticeably smaller this month, you listen to her grumbling without adding fuel, understanding that today's slight might be tomorrow's opening for someone else. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. You, living inside it, experience something that sits between captivity and privilege. You are physically contained. Yes, guards stand at certain gateways, and your movements are tracked. Yet within the enclosure, you manage your own small world, choosing which shrines to visit most often, which friendships to cultivate, which servants to trust with your confidences. You might inherit or receive items you can bequeath, and you may send messages beyond the palace through trusted intermediaries, nudging the world outside in small ways. Children are everywhere here. Some are obviously royal, their features echoing the king's, their heads shaved in the side lock of youth, seen so often in tomb paintings. They are attended by tutors and nurses, their lessons in writing, ritual, and deportment taken seriously. Others are the children of lesser wives, concubines, or attendants, sharing games but destined for very different futures. In their play, you catch glimpses of later battles. Who is allowed to speak louder? Whose small misdeeds are punished, and whose are overlooked? Which boy pretends to be king in their mock processions? You make a point of kindness toward children who cross your path. You offer a fig here, a gentle word there, knowing that any one of these small figures might one day hold a title that matters. Prince, general, high priest, steward. In Egypt, as in many courts, today's child is tomorrow's gatekeeper. In private corners, when the nurses have ushered the younger ones away and the older girls are gathered with their weaving, more dangerous topics surface. Someone mentions a quarrel between two senior wives, carefully unnamed, over whose son received more attention during a recent ceremony. Another hints that a foreign-born queen has been writing letters to her family abroad, anxious to ensure their support if palace fortunes change. You listen and store the fragments, never repeating them outside the circle in which you heard them. You have seen enough already to know that these seemingly small tensions can grow into something larger. In later years, a famous conspiracy will erupt in a royal harem during a king's reign, an intricate plot involving a minor wife and her son attempting to overthrow the designated heir. Scribes will record the trials, speaking of interrogations and punishments. Historians far in the future will study those papyri and argue about how typical this event is, about whether the harem is routinely a political tinderbox, or usually a quieter place where only occasionally, under the pressure of succession, sparks catch. For now, in your time, the tensions remain mostly hidden beneath layers of ritual and routine. The women's house is outwardly a place of beauty, musicians practicing harps and lutes in a side chamber, dancers rehearsing for festivals, perfumers mixing oils from imported myrrh and local herbs. In the evenings, lamps are lit in niches, casting warm halos on painted walls, and women gather to share stories under the soft buzz of conversation. Yet you know, as you recline on your bed at the end of the day, that this is also a place of secrets. Loves and jealousies, alliances and grudges, hopes for children's, futures and fears of being forgotten, all swirl together in the air you breathe. You have begun to find your own small circle of trust here, women whose laughter feels like a shelter rather than a threat, but you never fully relax your attention. Within these walls, your life is rich in companionship, but narrow in horizon. You rarely see the streets beyond the palace, the markets where ordinary women haggle over fish and onions, the workshops where artisans carve and paint the goods that fill your rooms. What you do see, in great detail, are the faces and moods of those who share your enclosure. You are learning that, for a pharaoh's wife, politics is not only what happens in grand halls and temples, it is also what happens over shared bowls of stew and whispered conversations in the dim light after the lamps are trimmed. The shift in your status does not happen in a single thunderclap moment. It begins as a change in how people look at you. One morning, as you cross a courtyard toward the small chapel where you often offer incense, you notice that an official who once barely inclined his head now bows more deeply. A steward who used to speak through intermediaries addresses you directly. A junior wife who once treated you as an equal now waits a breath longer before taking her seat. Word has spread. The king's attention has lingered on you, and more than once. Perhaps a child has been born a son, or a daughter beloved, and with that birth, your branch of the family tree has thickened. Perhaps your lineage, your family's loyalty, and the careful way you have navigated palace currents have combined in your favor. In any case, the title comes. You are named among the great royal wives, a rank echoed in inscriptions and on the lips of priests. You see the change first in writing. A scribe unrolls a fresh piece of papyrus for you, the fibers still faintly damp and smelling of the Nile mud from which they were made. With practiced strokes, he draws your name inside a cartouche not always granted to royal women, but in some reigns, bestowed on those closest to the king. Beside it, he adds great royal wife, mistress of the two lands, or a similar epithet, linking your identity to the territory over which your husband rules. From now on, when you stand beside the king in public, you do so with a different kind of visibility. On days when he appears at the window of appearances to grant gifts or be seen by officials and troops, you may be stationed at a nearby opening, veiled or partly concealed, but clearly present to those who know where to look. In ceremonial processions from the palace to the great temples, Karnak, Luxor, or the main sanctuary of a delta capital, you ride in a gilded chariot or carry yourself in a litter, your linen dress finer, your broad collar heavier with gold. In temple courtyards, you feel the stone under your sandaled feet vibrate faintly with the drums and chants of priests. The air is thick with incense, frankincense and myrrh from far-off lands, sweet blue lotus from the Nile's marshes. Colossal statues of gods and kings look down, their faces carved into expressions of eternal composure. When the king approaches the sanctuary, you follow to a certain point, stopping where ritual demands, your presence a visible reminder that royal authority is not a solitary thing, but a network of bodies, names, and roles. Your own role in the religious life of the court deepens. You sponsor offerings to deities particularly associated with women and queens, Hathor, Isis, Mut. In some periods, a great royal wife may hold the title God's Wife of Amun, or Hand of the God, implying a special closeness to the divine. You might not bear those specific words, depending on your time and dynasty, but you understand the principle. Your body, your fertility, your participation in rituals are seen as part of the machinery that keeps the cosmos in balance. On festival days, like Opet in Thebes, you join the procession that carries Amun's Barke from his great house at Karnak to the temple at Luxor. The sacred boat, gilded and heavy, rides on the shoulders of priests, its canopy hiding the god's image. Crowds line the processional way, the broad avenue flanked by sphinxes. They shout praises to the king, but some eyes also turn toward you and the other royal women, catching glimpses of your jewelry, your wigs scented with cones of perfumed fat that slowly melt in the sun. You lift a sistrum, that metal rattle shaped like the temple facade, and shake it in time with the hymns. The sound is bright and chiming, cutting through the deeper drums and voices. Reliefs on temple walls show scenes like this: royal women standing behind the king, their arms raised, their identities pinned in place by carved captions. Tie, Nefertari, Ahmosa Nefertari, names that will survive millennia. Your own participation may never be carved so prominently, but in the moment, as the procession moves and the crowd cries out, the distinction between famous queen and lesser-known great royal wife feels thin. You are all part of the same ritual tapestry. With your elevated title comes more direct involvement in temple patronage. You meet with high priests of Amun, Ptah, or other local gods discussing endowments, fields whose harvest will fund daily offerings, workshops whose output will clothe statues, staff whose wages must be secured. A scribe reads lists aloud. X aruras of grainland, Y head of cattle, Z fisherman. You ask questions, learned from your earlier lessons and sharpened by your growing confidence. Are the fields near reliable water? Are the temple storehouses in good repair? Sometimes you commission your own small chapels or statues. Perhaps in a side court at a major temple, a modest stone figure of you is carved, standing behind the king or alone, wearing the vulture headdress or modius crown with plumes. On the base, inscriptions praise you as beloved of a god, as one who causes the name of the king to flourish. Centuries later, archaeologists will find some of these pieces broken, reused as building material in later structures. They will piece them together in museum galleries, and scholars will debate how much actual authority the women they represent held. Some will argue, with examples in hand, that certain great royal wives wielded significant power behind the scenes, influencing succession, guiding policy during their son's minority, or serving as key religious figures whose rituals underpinned royal legitimacy. Others will caution that visible honor does not always equate to real influence, reminding their colleagues that temple reliefs are propaganda as much as records. The debate will continue, shifting with new finds and new interpretations. You, sitting with a priest in a private temple chamber as he unrolls an offering list for your approval, feel both sides of that argument inside your own skin. You are aware that, Officially, your role is to support, adorn, and sanctify the king's rule. Yet you also know that when you suggest a particular temple be favored this year, or when you ask whether a certain statue might show you alongside the king and a god, people listen. The choices you make in these conversations ripple outward. A more prosperous temple here, a more visible deity there, a monument that will carry your name just a little further into time. Back in the palace, your apartments expand. You now have more rooms assigned to you, space for your personal shrine, for storage of textiles and perfumes, for the reception of visitors who come not only to gossip, but to seek your intercession. A minor official might ask you to mention his name in passing to the king when the matter of promotions arises. A priest's sister might beg you to put in a good word so her brother can be assigned to a more prestigious temple shift. You rarely promise anything outright. That would be dangerous, binding you to outcomes you cannot fully control. Instead, you offer courteous phrases. I will remember your words. I will look favorably upon your request. Sometimes, in a quiet moment with your husband, you do mention a name, gently, as part of a longer conversation about temple needs or court harmony. Sometimes your suggestion is acted on. Sometimes it is not. Either way, you are present at the edge of decisions that affect lives far from these decorated walls. The weight of crown and temple settles across your shoulders gradually, like a heavy necklace you grow used to wearing. In public, you are the embodiment of harmony, standing serene beside the king, your presence reinforcing the image of a stable, prosperous realm under divine guidance. In private, you are acutely aware of how fragile that harmony can be. A poor flood, a military setback, a quarrel among powerful priests, any of these can strain the relationship between palace and temple, between king and people. At night, when the day's ceremonies are over and the last hymn has faded from the temple courtyards, you return to your rooms, remove the weight of gold and lapis from your neck, and wash off the kohl that framed your eyes. In the small glow of an oil lamp, your face looks younger, more tired, more human. You are not a goddess, not truly, no matter what the reliefs say. You are a person moving carefully through a world that wants you to be symbol and instrument at once. You lie down, listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls, the occasional bark of a dog, the call of a boatman on the river, a late song drifting from a tavern you will never enter. Somewhere out there, ordinary women sleep after days of grinding grain and carrying water, their prayers simpler, their concerns more immediate. Here, in the heart of the royal household, your prayers are tangled with the fate of temples and the image of the crown. Both kinds of petition rise into the same night sky, toward the same stars glittering above the dark line of the western hills where the royal tombs lie. You begin to notice, after a time, that not all of the king's concerns are carved on stone within Egypt's borders. Some of them arrive on clay. One afternoon, as the heat presses down on the palace roofs and the Nile air hangs heavy with the smell of mud and reeds, a small procession enters the administrative court. Messengers from a distant land, their clothing cut differently, their hair arranged in styles you do not see along the river. They carry nothing that gleams like treasure. Instead, they guard small clay tablets, packed carefully in boxes, their surfaces covered in tight, wedge-shaped impressions. These are letters from other great kings, rulers of Hatti, Babylon, Mitanni, and beyond, written in a diplomatic language of the day, Akkadian, impressed in cuneiform signs. In some reigns, entire archives of such tablets accumulate. In one city that will later be known as Akhetaten, modern scholars will uncover hundreds of them, the baked remains of correspondence that once flowed like a steady stream between Egypt and other powers. You do not read cuneiform yourself. Few at this court do. Egyptian scribes, trained in this foreign system, gather around the tablets, dampening them slightly if needed, and murmur as they decipher the clustered wedges. They translate the words into Egyptian, writing new versions on papyrus for the king and his advisors. You sit nearby on occasion, perhaps veiled or seated behind a screen, listening as fragments of faraway voices cross the room. My brother, many of these kings write, using the customary address between rulers who consider themselves equals. They ask about the pharaoh's health, about the state of the land, about gold. Gold, they say, is as plentiful in Egypt as dust, and they ask sometimes politely, sometimes sharply for more of it, as payment for daughters already sent, or as encouragement for alliances still fragile. One king might complain that the previous shipment of gold contained too much copper, hinting that trust can be measured in the purity of a metal as much as in words. You hear your husband's scribes discuss these complaints, a hint of irritation in their voices. Egypt, rich in gold from Nubian mines, sees itself as the generous giver in these exchanges, but generosity has limits. To send more or less, sooner or later, is not just a financial decision. It is a statement about how seriously Egypt takes its brother on the other end of the clay. You are reminded, listening, that marriage in your world is rarely only about two people. It is about lines on a map, about trade routes and military campaigns and the gods invoked in treaties. Somewhere in a foreign palace hundreds of miles away, a princess like you once were has left her own household to join that of another king. She has brought dowry, attendants, and perhaps her own gods in small portable images. Her presence in that court is a bond, a sign that the two realms are joined not just by ink and clay, but by flesh and fertility. Sometimes, such women are sent to Egypt as well. In certain periods, foreign-born queens live within these same palace walls, their names and titles appearing here and there in records. You may know one or two. A princess from Mitanni, whose father once treated with your husband's predecessor, or a Hittite woman whose marriage sealed a peace after long war. Their Egyptian may be fluent by the time you meet them, but their accent, their taste in jewelry, and their private prayers remind you that they grew up under different skies. With them, over shared meals or in quiet moments near the palace gardens, you sometimes speak of the letters that pass between courts. One may have seen her father's scribe inscribe a clay tablet before she ever left home. Another may hear news of her distant family only when messengers arrive with new dispatches. You feel, in those conversations, the thin cords that stretch from this palace out to others, vibrating with news you cannot fully control. As a great royal wife, you are not merely a spectator in this diplomatic web. When foreign envoys are formally received, you may be present at the edge of the hall, your figure part of the display of Egypt's wealth and order. You sit or stand in garments chosen to impress, fine linen, gold collars, earrings that sway like small suns when you turn your head. To envoys from lands where queens are less visible, the sight of you and other royal women near the king reinforces the impression that this court is large, stable, and confident enough to show its inner circle. In more private settings, your role can be subtler. A foreign-born queen within the harem might come to you to ask that a particular message be handled with care, that a letter to her father be expedited, for example, or that a complaint about mistreatment from a distant vassal be framed in a way that will not reflect poorly on her own kin. You cannot dictate policy, but you can sometimes influence tone. On another day, a scribe brings you a text to review, a letter that will be sent, formally, in the king's name to a foreign court, where one of your daughters is now queen. Officially, it is a communication between kings. Unofficially, it carries a few lines that a father directs to his child, inquiries after health, mention of gifts being sent, a reassurance that her name is remembered at home. You read these parts with a softness you cannot show in public. You suggest a slight change here or there, a warmer phrase, a subtler reminder of Egypt's generosity. Later, historians will pore over the surviving foreign letters and note how often Egyptian kings emphasize their wealth and divine favor, how often other rulers request gold or brides, how ritualized the language of love and brotherhood becomes. Some scholars will argue that these words reflect genuine attempts to maintain peace among roughly equal powers. Others will stress the underlying competition, the constant jockeying for prestige and advantage. The tablets themselves will not settle the matter entirely. From your vantage point within the palace, the ambiguity is simply reality. You watch as one delivery of letters brings news of peace, greetings, gifts, perhaps a promise of joint action against a mutual enemy, while the next brings thinly veiled reproaches. You see your husband's mood shift with the contents. See the advisors around him, calculate how military strength, trade, and family ties intersect. Your own children's marriages may become part of these calculations, their futures plotted on maps you glimpse only briefly. Sometimes, at night, you step out onto a small balcony overlooking a quiet courtyard and imagine the routes these messengers travel, across deserts, along rivers, through mountain passes and tangled trade roads. You picture them carrying the weight of clay tablets wrapped in cloth, the names of kings and queens pressed into the surface in signs they themselves may not read. Somewhere on those routes, rain may fall or sandstorms may rise, and a letter intended to smooth tensions could be delayed or lost, its absence interpreted as insult. In those moments, the palace feels both vast and small. Vast, because its decisions ripple out to places you will never see. Small, because all that movement and risk is funneled back into a single set of rooms, where ink dries on papyrus and clay hardens in the sun. The world of great kings can be reduced, at least for a time, to a tabletop scattered with tablets and scrolls, and to the conversations that take place around them. You have learned enough now to understand that your own presence in these conversations matters. Even if you speak only a few words, even if you merely tilt the balance slightly when a decision is being weighed, your perspective shaped by life in the woman's house, by your ties to temples, by your knowledge of which alliances are fragile, adds a thread to the fabric. Some future historians will look at the diplomatic letters and see mostly the voices of kings and male officials. A few will look more carefully and ask where the queens are in these exchanges, the mothers and wives who gave and received daughters, who hosted foreign brides, who comforted or counseled husbands after difficult news arrived. They will suggest, cautiously, that the written record underestimates the extent to which women like you shaped the tone, if not always the content, of international relations. You do not think of it in such terms. You think of the heaviness in your chest when a letter brings word that a distant ally king has died, and his son, whom you do not know, now sits on his throne. You think of the letters that cross the desert, carrying congratulations, condolences, and veiled warnings all at once. You think of the women whose lives, like yours, have been carried from one palace to another in the name of friendship between lands that, without those bridges of marriage and words, might more easily slip into war. Back in your chamber, as you prepare for sleep, you dip your fingers in scented oil and touch your brow lightly, a small private ritual. Outside, the messengers' quarters are quiet for the night, their clay tablets safely stored until morning. In the silence, you feel the empire's connections stretching out from the palace like threads in the dark, some taut, some frayed, all of them humming with possibility and risk. You close your eyes, knowing that when messengers arrive again, their words will once more pass through these halls, and you will be there to hear the distant voices of other thrones carried on the soft, brittle language of clay. While letters of clay and papyrus travel between distant thrones, the most decisive messages for your own future are carried not by messengers, but by midwives' hands. In the quiet inner rooms of the women's house, pregnancies are tracked as carefully as any treaty. You remember the first time your own body announced a possible change in the balance of power, the missed bleeding, the strange mix of nausea and appetite, the heavy sleep that stole over you in the afternoons. Around you, older women noticed before you said a word. Servants adjusted how they lifted baskets, how they guided you downstairs. A midwife, summoned without drama, pressed gentle fingers against your abdomen and nodded with the calm of someone who has done this many times. From that moment, the air around you changed. The same officials and attendants who used to pass you in the corridor with polite bows now watched you a little more closely. The senior women of the palace, especially those whose own children were grown, came to visit with soft questions and firmer advice. A physician checked your pulse and eyes, bringing with him a small kit of remedies, herbs to coax appetite, amulets against misfortune, perhaps a frog-shaped charm of faience placed nearby as a symbol of fertility. Childbirth is always dangerous, in every rank of society. In your world, even queens can die in labor. Archaeologists in far-off ages will find tombs that suggest mothers and infants lost together, dates of death carved close beside one another. The palace cannot entirely shield you from this reality, but it can ease some risks. Clean linens, experienced midwives, access to the best herbs and poultices known to your time. When the labor itself comes, it is a storm contained inside a small room. The midwives support you, perhaps helping you onto a special birth stool, engraved with protective symbols. Female relatives and attendants recite prayers to Tauret, the hippo-shaped goddess who guards women in childbirth, and to Bez, the dwarf god, whose fierce face is meant to frighten away harm. Outside the chamber, the palace listens. When finally a child's cry cuts through the thick air, it is not only a human sound, it is a political announcement. If the newborn is a son of the king, the news moves swiftly. A servant slips out to inform scribes and officials. Priests may be notified, so that appropriate offerings can be made. A nurse cleans the baby, noting small details that every mother cares about: fingers, toes, a strong voice, and that the court cares about as symbols: an auspicious birthmark, a robust size. If the child is a girl, there is still joy, still ceremony. Royal daughters can become valuable in diplomatic marriages or powerful as priestesses. Egypt will one day know queens who rule in their own right, or as near equals, alongside kings, like Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, whose statues and reliefs present her with full kingly regalia. Yet in the immediate arithmetic of succession, sons weigh differently. The rooms of the women's house feel that difference even when no one says it aloud. You hold your newborn and feel layers of emotion stack within you: relief that you lived, fierce attachment to this small, squirming life, and a dawning awareness that this child is not only yours. He or she belongs also to the palace, to the line of kings, to the expectations of ancestors and gods. Titles will follow: king's son of his body, king's eldest daughter, words that fix a tiny person into the broader story of the two lands. As months pass and more children are born to the king by different mothers, the nursery becomes its own kind of map. Rooms fill with cradles, little stools, toys carved from wood and molded from clay balls, animal figures, miniature furniture. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. In your daily life, you see it firsthand. A prince clinging to the neck of his nurse in moments of fear or excitement, his small hands trusting her more than anyone else for comfort. As a mother, you move within this world with mixed feelings. You are grateful for the care your child receives, for the scribes who will teach him to read, for the weapons master who will one day train him to drive a chariot and shoot arrows, for the tutors who will drill him in the rituals and formulas of kingship if he is marked as a likely heir. At the same time, you are acutely aware that every kindness bestowed on another woman's child might, in the imagined future, stand in the way of your own child's ascent. You are not alone in this awareness. Conversations among royal mothers are layered. On the surface, you share advice about teething remedies, about which lullabies soothe the quickest, about how to interpret a fever. Beneath that, you are constantly measuring how often each prince is summoned to appear beside the king, how prominently their names are spoken in public rituals, whether a particular child receives a distinctive title earlier than expected. Some reigns provide clear examples of what many sons in succession look like. In the days of Ramesses II, for instance, inscriptions will list a long line of princes, many of whom never reach the throne. The eventual successor, Merneptah, is not the eldest son, but one who survives and rises through changing fortunes. Modern scholars will piece together this story from tombs in the Valley of the Kings and from palace reliefs, noting how birth order is only one factor among many. In your own time, the pattern may be similar. An eldest son, born to a favoured great royal wife, might seem the obvious heir, but a younger son, perhaps more capable or better supported by key officials and priests, could gain influence. A child of a foreign-born mother might be seen as a bridge or as a liability depending on the political climate. Within the women's house, these possibilities transform the nursery into a quiet battlefield. No swords are drawn here, but alliances are. You share a joke with another mother, one whose son plays often with yours, and you notice the way her eyes soften when she looks at your child. Later, when a minor dispute arises in the women's quarters, she takes your side with an ease that suggests the bond is real. It is friendship, but it is also calculation. You, too, learn to place your kindness strategically. You praise the gentle nature of another woman's boy in front of her, knowing how a mother's heart responds to such words. You ensure that your son is taught to show respect to older half-brothers, not because you doubt his worth, but because overt arrogance would paint a target on his back long before he is strong enough to defend himself. Historians far in the future, reading fragments of court records and later tales, will debate how much these maternal rivalries and alliances truly shaped succession. Some will argue that the king's choice and the support of male advisors matter most. Others will emphasize the harem as a breeding ground for factions. The truth likely weaves both strands together. Formal decisions made in council halls, softened or sharpened by years of quiet influence, in rooms full of beds, toys, and lullabies. As your children grow older, their world slowly separates from yours. Princes are taken more often to the training fields, to the temples, to the council chambers, where they sit behind their father and learn to listen. Princesses are introduced to the routines of ritual and the possibilities of marriage alliances. Their futures traced along lines that may lead to foreign courts or powerful priestly roles. You watch them from a little distance now, seeing signs of their character emerging. A boy's impatience at a minor official's delay, a girl's sharp memory for who said what and when. You correct where you can, smoothing rough edges with gentle counsel, but you cannot fully shield them from the dynamics that shaped you. The careful weighing of words, the danger of ill-timed honesty, the necessity of reading a room quickly and well. At night, when the children finally sleep and the women's house grows quieter, you sometimes walk alone in a small garden inside the palace walls. The sky above is clear, the Milky Way arching like a ghostly reflection of the Nile's curve. You think of all the royal mothers who have walked in similar gardens before you, worrying over sons and daughters whose names may now be lost or half erased on stone. You know, deep down, that you cannot fully control what will happen when the question of succession comes sharply into focus. A sudden illness, a political upheaval, a shift in priestly support, any of these could reorder the careful hopes you have woven. But you also know that your love for your children, your daily choices in how you raise them, and your willingness to navigate the delicate web of maternal politics will leave traces, even if the official records never speak your name with the same clarity they reserve for kings. In this way, the nursery and the council chamber are joined. The fates of lands and armies grow, quietly, from nights of rocking infants under lamplight, from stories told at bedside, from whispered advice to a child about when to speak and when to hold his tongue. You stand at that junction, both mother and political actor, your heart divided and united all at once. It begins, as so many changes do, with small absences. At first, you notice it only in passing. A steward in the woman's house mutters that the bread rations are a little smaller this month, the beer a bit thinner. A servant complains that the grain arriving from a particular district is late, and when someone jokes about lazy peasants, he does not laugh. It's the flood, he says instead, eyes tired. The river did not come high enough. You know, in theory, how much Egypt depends on the Nile's rhythm. Every year, the inundation is meant to swell over the fields, leaving behind a clean layer of silt that will feed the next harvest. When the floods are good, the granaries fill, taxes come in without too much resistance, and the king appears in temple reliefs as the guarantor of abundance. When they are poor, the whole country feels the lack. This year, the watermarks on the riverbank stones were lower than anyone liked. Priests performed the usual rites, asking Hapi, the spirit of the flood, for generosity, but no ceremony can force the river higher. Now, months later, the consequences begin to flow back toward the palace like an echo. In the administrative courts, scribes unroll long papyrus scrolls filled with lists of grain deliveries, tax quotas, and exemptions. You hear snippets as you pass. A village in Middle Egypt that petitioned for relief. A temple estate that insists its dues must not be cut. A garrison commander requesting extra rations for troops near a restless border. The officials' voices sound tight, like reed pens pressed too hard on papyrus. The women's house, which often feels sealed off from such worries, cannot remain untouched. One morning, the head of provisions comes to speak with the senior wives. He explains, with many apologies and formulaic phrases about the king's care for his household, that some luxury items, imported wine, certain fragrant unguents, rare foods, will be less frequent for a time. There is no suggestion of actual hunger within the palace. Your store of bread, beer, and basic staples remains secure. But even this minor tightening sends ripples through the rooms. If shortages reach you here, sheltered at the center, what must they feel like in the villages along the floodplain? News trickles in through servants whose relatives work on royal projects. From a woman who has a cousin among the tomb builders on the West Bank at Thebes, you hear something startling. The workers have refused, for several days, to go into the Valley of the Kings. Their rations, she says, have been delayed too often. They laid down their tools, walked out, and carried their complaints straight to a temple where they knew the gods and the authorities would hear. Centuries later, scribes' records from the village of Deir el-Medina will reveal this as one of the earliest known labor strikes in history, around the 12th century BCE. Those texts will list the arguments, the men saying they have no food, demanding their wages in grain, the officials scrambling to find supplies. Historians will debate how exceptional this event was, how far it reflects broader instability late in the New Kingdom. For you, hearing it not as a line in a papyrus, but as a rumor carried by a nervous servant, it feels like a crack in something that was supposed to be solid. The artisans who carve and paint the royal tombs are among the most skilled workers in Egypt, their village privileged in many ways. If they are so pressed that they dare to protest, what must life be like for farmers under less direct royal protection? Alongside the stories of grain trouble come reports from the frontiers. Messengers arrive with dust on their clothes and tightness in their faces. You hear that groups from the West Libyan tribes have been testing Egypt's borders again, or that peoples of the sea, strange confederations whose names will later be carved in fierce scenes on temple walls at places like Medinet Habu, have attacked coastal towns. Sometimes the news is good. The army has beaten them back, captured captains, seized ships. Sometimes it is less clear. The threat is contained, an official says, but he does not quite meet anyone's eyes. In council, your husband and his advisors weigh these reports against the grain lists. Armies need food, so do temple estates, whose rituals are supposed to ensure divine favor and cosmic order. When harvests are good, there is enough to satisfy both. When they are poor, hard choices begin to appear. The high priests of major gods, Amun in Thebes, Ptah in Memphis, argue that cutting temple rations endangers the favor of heaven. Tax officials warn that squeezing villagers harder will produce not more grain, but more hiding, more resentment. You are not in the room for every such discussion, yet the outcomes reach you quickly. Priests request that you, as great royal wife, sponsor additional offerings, special processions, and night-long vigils in temple courts to petition for better floods. You agree, of course. On certain evenings, you stand with other royal women beneath tall columns painted to resemble marsh plants, the flicker of hundreds of oil lamps turning the hypostyle hall into a forest of trembling light. The air is almost too thick to breathe, heavy with incense and sung prayers. As you shake a sistrum before a statue of a goddess, perhaps Mut, consort of Ammon, or Isis, whose patient magic is said to knit broken things, you are acutely aware that these rituals are both expressions of faith and gestures of policy. A people struggling with hunger needs to see that their rulers are asking the gods for relief. The king's wife, visible in the torchlit courtyards, becomes part of that reassurance, an image of continuity, of piety, of the old patterns still being followed. Back in the palace, you notice more signs that the outer world is pressing inward. An official in charge of royal building projects complains, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that his workers sometimes vanish between one dawn and the next, slipping away to their home villages, where at least they can appeal directly to local authorities for food. A scribe mutters that tomb robbery trials are taking up more of his time than before, as desperate men break into old burials seeking gold and portable wealth. Later, scholars will read trial records from the late New Kingdom that detail such thefts in painstaking lines: who broke into which tomb, what they took, how they melted down metals and tore linen from mummies. They will argue over whether these crimes reflect a general collapse of royal authority or more localized breakdowns, perhaps encouraged by underpaid guards and officials. You, hearing of them as current events, feel them as further symptoms of strain. Tombs are not just storehouses of treasure, they are the carefully prepared homes of the dead, including kings your husband honors publicly as ancestors. To hear that their resting places have been violated is to feel that the boundary between ordered world and encroaching chaos has thinned. Within the women's house, anxiety manifests in quieter ways. Some wives begin to hoard small luxuries, favoring durable items like jewelry over delicate perfumes that can run out. Others commission more amulets for their children, more protective spells painted on bedroom walls. Conversations drift more often toward omens, an unusual position of the stars, an unexpected behavior in temple oracles, a dream that seems heavy with meaning. You find yourself caught between two roles. As a person, you worry about your children, about the future of the land whose rhythms you have come to feel in your bones. As a great royal wife, you must project calm. When you walk through the courtyards, you keep your shoulders relaxed, your voice steady. You praise the king's strength and wisdom within earshot of servants and minor officials. Understanding that such remarks will travel outward, you increase your visible generosity within the palace, ensuring that your own attendants and lesser wives under your influence do not feel neglected. Historians looking back on the late New Kingdom will argue about the causes of its troubles. Some will emphasize environmental factors, possibly a series of low Nile floods, maybe climate variations affecting grain supplies and migrations across the eastern Mediterranean. Others will stress internal issues, the rising power of certain priesthoods, especially at Thebes, drawing resources and authority away from the king, bureaucratic corruption, the sheer weight of maintaining far-flung territories. Still, others will point to external pressures, invasions, piracy, shifting trade routes. No single explanation will satisfy everyone. From inside the palace, you do not sort events into neat theories. You feel them as layered pressures. The king grows more concerned with oracles and prophecies. Advisors speak in more guarded tones. Requests from temples and garrisons pile up like driftwood against a riverbank. Even your own days change. More rituals, more audiences with petitioners, hoping that proximity to you will secure them some protection from the tightening world outside. One evening, as you sit by a small window overlooking the western horizon, you watch the sun sink behind the line of hills that hides the Valley of the Kings. The sky burns orange and then deepens to purple. The tombs beyond those ridges holding generations of kings whose reigns also saw good years and bad, floods and failures, victories and anxieties. You realize that for all the talk of divine order and eternal might, every reign is, in its own way, an improvisation against uncertainty. The problems of the kingdom, grain, soldiers, taxes, raiders, have reached your ears and shaped your days. They have threaded themselves into the fabric of your marriage, your motherhood, your prayers. In the courtyards below, the palace lamps are being lit one by one, small, steady flames against the gathering dark. You draw your shawl a little tighter around your shoulders. The night ahead will be filled with ordinary tasks, baths, meals, conversations, but the knowledge remains. The outside world is no longer a distant abstraction. It presses against these walls in every trimmed ration and every urgent letter, reminding you that to be a pharaoh's wife is to live where personal life and public crisis meet, as close to the center of the storm as one can be without wearing the crown itself. When pressures from beyond the palace walls grow heavier, the air inside the woman's house thickens in a different way. Worries about grain and borders turn inward, becoming whispers in corridors, sidelong glances over shared meals, and careful questions cloaked in concern. You feel it first in how conversations change. Where once the talk among royal wives and concubines circled around children's milestones, temple festivals, and small slights, now it loops more often toward the king's health, his temper, his choices about which sons to promote and which to overlook. The politics of the wider kingdom seep in, and with them, the stakes of every relationship sharpen. One evening, as you sit in a side chamber with a few women you have known for years, an innocuous comment lands with unexpected weight. Someone remarks that a particular prince has been summoned to stand beside the king more often in public ceremonies. Another replies, in a tone that tries for casual, "Yes, but his mother's people are not well liked by the high priests." The room goes quieter, as if everyone is checking how far that thought will go. You understand the underlying arithmetic. In a court where several sons might claim a reasonable path to the throne, the mothers of those sons rarely feel truly neutral. The more ill fortune presses on the country, poor floods, foreign threats, strained finances, the more urgent the question becomes. Who will inherit this complex, troubled realm when the king's heart stops beating? There have always been rivalries in royal households. In earlier centuries, stories were told of foreign wives resented by local queens, of senior mothers bristling at the sudden favor shown to younger women. But in your time, with stability less certain, those rivalries risk becoming something more dangerous. Rumors begin to move through the women's quarters, like faint drafts in the night. A certain wife, less favored in recent years, is said to be consulting more often with a particular official who has access to the army. Another is observed speaking in low tones with a chief steward from the granaries, their conversations ending quickly when anyone approaches. None of this is proof of anything criminal. In a palace this interwoven, every woman must talk to officials. Every official must seek patrons. Yet pattern-seeking minds, sharpened by anxiety, start connecting dots. You remember, perhaps, older tales of harem plots, one particularly famous in later centuries, during the reign of a king like Ramesses III, when a secondary wife and her son conspired to overthrow the designated heir. In that case, papyri will one day record the trials, naming judges and accused conspirators, describing written spells and secret messages. Historians will pore over those texts, arguing about how widespread the conspiracy truly was, about whether it represented a deep fracture within the royal family or a more contained explosion of ambition. Your own time may or may not see something so dramatic recorded, but you live under the shadow of knowing that such things are possible. The harem, this cluster of rooms, gardens, and shrines, can be a space of music, motherhood, and devotional calm. It can also, under the right or wrong conditions, become a crucible for plots. You become more careful about what you say and to whom. A minor wife, still young but increasingly resentful, tries to draw you into sharper complaints. Is it just that his eldest son should receive everything when others are braver, when others' mothers are more devoted? You answer her with a blend of gentleness and caution, acknowledging that fate can be hard while steering the conversation back to safer ground. The unpredictability of the gods, the importance of honoring all royal children without trying to guess the end of their stories too soon. At the same time, you cannot ignore the subtle shifts in your surroundings. Guards change their patterns. You notice different faces at posts you pass every day. An official from the internal security apparatus, the palace police, in effect pays a visit to the senior women and, in the politest tones, reminds everyone of the importance of loyalty and decorum. He speaks of unnamed ill-wishers and of the king's desire that his household remain pure in heart. The phrases are mild, but the message is clear. Someone, somewhere, has voiced concerns about intrigue. Servants feel the tension keenly. These women and men move between rooms, carrying water, food, linens, and, inevitably, bits of information. They know who is receiving more visits from certain officials, who seem suddenly more withdrawn, whose attendants are being questioned by scribes. As often happens in such times, they respond by choosing sides, sometimes consciously, sometimes simply by gravitating toward the person who seem safest to attach their fortunes to. You are not immune to the temptation to secure yourself. You make sure that the scribes who manage your property, lists and temple endowments are reputable, double-checking their accounts more often than before. You are careful not to be alone too frequently with any one official whose own loyalties might later be questioned. You cultivate a visible, steady piety, making regular offerings in palace chapels, so that, if accusations ever swirl, no one can easily paint you as a schemer who neglects the gods. Yet you know that appearances, while powerful, are not always enough. In the famous harem conspiracy of Ramesses III's time, some accused conspirators were high-ranking and outwardly pious. The papyri describing their trial show how quickly people could be ensnared once suspicion took root. Scholars many centuries later will debate whether those documents exaggerate the plot to justify harsh punishments, or whether they understate the breadth of fear it caused. They will note, too, how the focus falls heavily on certain women and their sons, reflecting ancient anxieties about female influence in succession politics. You can feel, even without reading such future analyses, how deeply those anxieties run. A pharaoh cannot rule without women, without mothers to bear princes, without wives to stand beside him at rituals, without priestesses and chantresses to fill the temples with music. Yet those same women, if united behind an alternative heir, could theoretically change the course of dynastic history. That possibility hovers in the minds of security officials, priests, and sometimes the king himself, casting a shadow over even the most innocent conversations in the women's quarters. One evening, you are quietly summoned to speak with a trusted advisor of the king, someone who has known you long enough to believe in your loyalty. He asks, with a mixture of deference and frankness, whether you have noticed anything disturbing in recent interactions among the royal women. You choose your words with great care. You do not lie. Exactly. You acknowledge tensions, rivalries, sharp words. But you also emphasize the normalcy of such frictions in a household this large, pushing back gently against any narrative that would paint the entire woman's house as a nest of treachery. You are aware, even as you speak, that your testimony matters. In a world where formal records seldom capture women's private voices, this is one of the few spaces where your perspective can shape official understanding. Future historians, reading only the surviving legal texts, may underestimate how much influence wives and mothers had in turning suspicion aside from some and allowing it to fall on others. In the weeks that follow, there are small consequences. A particularly restless minor wife finds her access to certain areas quietly restricted. Her visits to key officials are curtailed under the pretext of reorganization. A steward whose name has come up too often in troubling contexts is reassigned to a distant royal estate. There is no public scandal, no mass arrests you can see from your vantage point, but you sense that an invisible pruning has taken place, branches cut before they could entangle more of the tree. The atmosphere in the women's house lightens slightly, though never again to the carefree level you remember from early years. You have lived through enough to know that suspicion, once awakened, never fully goes back to sleep. It simply changes its focus, moving on to other potential threats as circumstances evolve. In the privacy of your own mind, you also understand something uncomfortable, that the same web of watchfulness which can protect you today could, under different rulers or different fears, ensnare you tomorrow. Allegiance is often judged by outcomes. If your son prospers and proves loyal, your past will be read as a history of wise support. If he falters or offends powerful factions, those same actions might later be repainted as signs of dangerous ambition. Historians will later debate whether royal harems in New Kingdom Egypt are best understood as hotbeds of persistent plotting, or as mostly ordinary domestic spaces that only rarely flare into open conspiracy. They will argue over how the language of trial records exaggerates or distorts the reality of life in these quarters. Some will see the women's house primarily as a site of control, where royal wives and children are monitored. Others will emphasize its role as a political resource, a place where alliances are forged and maintained. You live in the tension between those interpretations. By day, you oversee servants, attend rituals, and manage your children's upbringing. By night, you lie awake longer than before, listening not only to the familiar sounds of the palace, the distant clatter of dishes, the murmur of guards, but also to the silence between them, wondering what conversations you are not hearing, what decisions are being made in chambers where your presence is not invited. You have learned, by now, that being a pharaoh's wife is not simply about luxury and ceremony. It is about moving carefully along the narrow edge between influence and accusation, between using your position to shape events and becoming a convenient target when others need someone to blame. The line is thin, and the higher you stand within the palace hierarchy, the more clearly you can feel the drop on either side. For all the unease you feel within the palace walls, there are days when you step into the sun and the kingdom looks, at least for a moment, exactly as the temple reliefs say it should. Those are the festival days, when the two lands dress themselves in color and sound, and your face becomes part of Egypt's public dream of harmony. On such a morning, you are woken earlier than usual by the clatter of preparations echoing through the palace. Servants move briskly in the corridors, arms full of linen, jewelry boxes, and cosmetic palettes. Outside, you can already hear the distant tuning of instruments, harps, lutes, and sistra being tested in quick, bright phrases. The smell of incense, stronger than on ordinary days, leaks in under your door. Today might be the Opet festival in Thebes, when the god Amun travels from his great temple at Karnak to Luxor, or the beautiful Feast of the Valley, when sacred barques cross the Nile to visit tombs on the west bank. The exact occasion changes from year to year, king to king, but the pattern remains. Gods leave their sanctuaries, the king shows himself to his people, and the palace presents a united front of order and joy. You dress with more ceremony than usual, your attendants smooth layers of fine linen over your body, adjust your broad collar of faience and gold so it sits perfectly balanced on your collarbones, and place a heavy wig on your head, its dark strands perfumed with a cone of scented fat that will slowly melt in the heat, releasing fragrance as the hours pass. They paint your eyes with kohl, dark lines extending toward your temples, both as adornment and as a protection against the sun's glare. When you emerge into the courtyard reserved for the royal family before processions, the light is already bright on polished stone. The king appears soon after, wearing a crown chosen for the festival, the tall double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, perhaps, or the blue war crown if the occasion also celebrates military victories. Around him gather princes, officials, and high priests, their linen kilts stiff with starch, their jewelry catching the light like captured sun. For the people waiting along the processional route, this is one of the rare days when the royal household steps outward from carved stone into moving, breathing reality. They have seen the king on temple walls, smiting enemies, or offering incense to gods. Now they see him in motion, chariot wheels creaking, horses tossing their heads, the royal figure standing tall and seemingly untroubled, and beside him, in her own chariot or litter, they see you and the other royal women, serene, adorned, a living confirmation that the royal house is flourishing. The processional way from Karnak to Luxor is lined with sphinxes, each squat guardian forming part of a stone colonnade under the open sky. On festival days, that avenue fills with people officials in designated places, but also ordinary townsfolk pressing as close as they dare. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders, straining for a glimpse. Women hold up offerings of flowers and small figurines, hoping the gods or the king will see. Behind and around the royal party, the true heart of the festival moves. The barque of Amun, carried on the shoulders of priests, its gilded wooden hull glittering in the sun. Within its shrine, hidden from public view, sits the cult statue of the god. Stops are made at chapels and way stations decorated for the occasion, where the bark is set down and rituals are performed away from the crowd. Later, temple scenes will show these moments in clean lines and detailed captions. Historians looking back will debate how much of what is carved matches the exact practice, and how much is idealized. You see only one side of these debates. From your vantage point near the king, you watch the faces of the people as the procession passes. For many, this is a rare taste of splendor. They wear their best clothes, necklaces of beads carefully restrung for the day. Some have travelled in from smaller villages, bearing offerings or petitions. For them, the sight of the king and his family standing under the protection of towering gods is reassuring, even if their ration jars at home have been worryingly low. Your own face becomes part of this reassurance. You hold your posture steady, your expression calm, your movements controlled. When you shake a sistrum in time with the temple musicians, you do so with measured grace, as if the sound itself could smooth the edges of the kingdom's worries. In some temple reliefs, royal women are shown in just this way, standing behind the king, shaking sistra, their titles identifying them as beloved of particular deities. Later scholars will argue about how these images relate to your actual influence, but in this moment, you are aware of your symbolic weight. Not all festivals are purely solemn. Some, especially those associated with Hathor and her joy-bringing aspect, include elements of deliberate excess. Music played late into the night, strong beer poured more freely, dancing that loosens the usual constraints. Archaeological and textual hints suggest that festivals of intoxication, like those attested at Dendera in later periods, allowed participants to become joyful with the goddess, shaking off everyday burdens. In the palace, you see a carefully filtered version of this. Wine flows more generously at evening banquets, musicians perform livelier songs, and some wives and officials let their laughter rise a little louder than usual. You allow yourself to relax slightly, though never fully. Even during moments of sanctioned exuberance, you remember that servants' eyes are everywhere, and that tales of who drank too much or spoke too freely will linger long after the last cup is emptied. These festival days are costly. The food, drink, incense, and textiles consumed in honor of the gods and in display of royal generosity represent a significant outlay, especially in lean years. Some modern historians will question whether such expenditures strained the economy further, while others will suggest that festivals are precisely what hold a stressed society together. Occasions when redistributions of food and public displays of piety reassure people that, despite hardship, the cosmic order is intact. From where you stand, the argument is not abstract. You see the hungry eagerness in the faces of poorer spectators when temple officials distribute bread and beer as part of the celebrations. You hear the way people talk after the procession, voices a little lighter. The king looked strong. The gods will be pleased. Next year's flood will be better. You also know that behind the scenes, scribes have negotiated carefully to make these displays possible without entirely emptying the storehouses. For you personally, festivals serve another function. They knit together the two halves of your life. In the woman's house, you navigate rivalry, suspicion, and maternal politics. In temple courts and along processional routes, you perform harmony. The dissonance can be jarring. You might stand shoulder to shoulder with another royal wife whose private hostility you know well, both of you smiling serenely for the benefit of the crowd. You may lift your hands in joint prayer with a woman who, in another context, would gladly see your son passed over for hers. You learn to live with these contradictions. In some ways, the festival scene, polished, controlled, richly symbolic, is no less real than the whispered tensions of the harem. It is simply a different layer of the same world, one that emphasizes ideals over messy specifics. Later historians, looking at reliefs of processions, will sometimes read them as straightforward propaganda. Others will look for hints of reality beneath the surface, tiny deviations or unusual details that might reflect particular historical moments. You, present in both public and private, understand that the truth lies between. The festivals are both sincere expressions of devotion and carefully managed performances. The smiles you offer the crowd are both genuine because there is beauty and reassurance in these rituals, and deliberate because you know how much the kingdom needs to see its rulers looking untroubled. At the end of a festival day, when you finally return to your rooms, your feet ache from standing, your throat is dry from incense and chanting, and your jewelry leaves faint impressions on your skin. Servants help you remove the wig, the heavy collar, the layers of linen. You wash your face and see, in the polished surface of a metal mirror, a woman who has played her part in a great, choreographed affirmation that all is well. You know, of course, that not everything is well. Grain is still tight in some districts. Letters from the frontiers still speak of tension. Murmurs in the women's house have not vanished. But you have also seen something that matters. The way thousands of people lined the route, shouted praises, and went home with at least a momentary sense of connection to their king, their gods, and a vision of order larger than their daily struggles. You lie down, muscles pleasantly tired, mind still echoing with the rhythms of drums and hymns. Outside, the city quiets gradually. The gods' barques are back in their sanctuaries, the statues once again hidden behind walls, the festival flags falling still. Tomorrow, the palace will return to its usual mix of routine and uncertainty. But tonight, the memory of processions under a bright sky lingers, a reminder that part of your duty as a pharaoh's wife is to be the visible calm at the surface of a deep, shifting river. You do not notice the change in your husband all at once. It arrives in increments, like the slow sinking of the sun toward the western hills. Not a single drop, but a series of small, almost imperceptible descents. At first, it is nothing more than a cough that lingers longer than it should, a stiffness when he rises from the low, cushioned chair in his audience hall. You see him wince slightly when he steps down from his chariot after a long procession, and a servant moves instinctively closer, just in case. He waves the concern away. But later that evening, when the sandals are off and the gold collar is laid aside, he presses his hand to his lower back and breathes out more slowly than usual. The physicians increase their visits. They bring with them boxes of remedies, resins and herbs, unguents scented with cedar and myrrh, concoctions written in their own neat medical handbooks. They murmur about diet, about rest, about balancing the body's forces with carefully chosen substances. Some treatments help, others pass without much effect. The king is still the king. He still appears in public, still presides over festivals, still drives his chariot when he must, but behind the scenes, you see the toll on his energy. As his strength ebbs, even slightly, you can feel the shape of power in the palace adjust. Advisors who once stood a little back now edge closer. The high priest of Amun, or of whatever major deity dominates your capital, speaks more often and at greater length. The vizier, that powerful chief administrator whose title appears in so many inscriptions, becomes more central than ever. The man who knows every petition, every tax report, every military dispatch, now sits for longer stretches in the king's presence, reading summaries aloud while the royal eyes close briefly in fatigue. You, as great royal wife, adapt as well. There are days when your husband prefers to keep formal audiences shorter and private conversations longer, calling you to sit beside him in a quieter courtyard room rather than in the grand throne hall. You listen as he speaks not only of the latest border reports, but of his own worries, about which son is truly ready to rule, about whether the gods are pleased, about the growing weight of temples whose endowments have expanded over the decades. In the late New Kingdom, the high priesthood of Amun at Thebes will become so powerful that some priests effectively share or challenge royal authority, their names and images carved in ways that almost rival those of kings. One such figure, Herihor, will later be depicted wearing regalia that blurs the line between priest and ruler. Historians will argue about how exactly this process unfolded, whether the priests seized power as the monarchy weakened, or whether kings deliberately ceded authority in exchange for divine support in troubled times. You live in the midst of that gradual tilt. There are practical signs: temples requesting more land, more workers, priests insisting that certain oracles must be consulted before major decisions are made. The king, more vulnerable now to physical discomfort and doubt, listens closely when a god's bark, carried by priests, seems to lean forward in answer to a question, or backward in refusal. Oracles, which may once have confirmed decisions already formed, begin to shape choices more actively. In council, there is a subtle change in who speaks first. Where once officials might wait in respectful silence for every word from the king's lips, now they sometimes offer suggestions more readily. May it please His Majesty to consider. Perhaps the good God might find favor in this plan. Their tones are still deferential, but you know how to hear the growing confidence underneath. Within the women's house, the king's aging brings another kind of shift. Younger wives who once pinned their hopes on catching his eye now refocus their ambitions on their sons, on influential brothers, on priests or generals who are likely to endure into the next reign. Conversations among senior women turn more often to the future, where each expects to stand when the crown passes to the next head, which alliances should be strengthened now so they will bear fruit later. You become, more and more, a bridge between generations. You know the king better than most. You also know the princes, their strengths and weaknesses, their rivalries and loyalties. The oldest among them may now lead campaigns or oversee major building projects, their names appearing alongside their fathers on stelae and temple walls. Younger sons, eager to prove themselves, sometimes speak with a dangerous impatience. In private moments, a son might come to you and say, half complaining, half pleading, "Father no longer listens as he once did." The vizier and the high priests speak, and he nods. Shouldn't a king rely more on his own blood? You answer with care, reminding him that rule is more than force of will. It is also compromise, and the art of knowing when to lean on others' expertise. At the same time, you cannot help but see his point. The king's reliance on advisors grows as his body tires, and with that reliance, their power thickens like clay around the foundation stones of the state. Historians, looking back, will craft narratives about this period: the decline of the new kingdom, the fragmentation of authority, the rise of regional power brokers. Some will argue that kings became mere figureheads in their later years, with real control resting in the hands of priests and generals. Others will push back, pointing out evidence of royal initiative, new building projects, and active foreign policy even late in certain reigns. As often, the truth is not a clean break, but a messy overlap. An aging king, still capable in some arenas, increasingly dependent in others. You see that overlap clearly in the rhythms of palace life. On some days, your husband rallies. He holds court with vigor, hears petitions sharply, even jokes with old comrades from earlier campaigns. On others, he is slow to rise, his voice hoarse, his patience thin. On those days, you and a few trusted officials quietly adjust the schedule, shortening audiences, deferring non-urgent matters, increasing the flow of offerings to the gods associated with healing. In this shifting landscape, your own influence becomes less direct and more about mediation. You speak with the high priest, framing your requests for temple support in ways that acknowledge his growing authority, while gently reminding him of the king's primacy. You counsel princes to show respect for the priesthood, without appearing submissive. You comfort nervous officials whose positions depend on the king's favor, suggesting ways they might prove their usefulness in whatever new order emerges. You also make preparations of a more personal kind. As the king's hair thins and his walk slows, you begin to think of what your life will be when his ends, not in a grasping way, but as a practical necessity. Will you become a queen mother with a strong role at court, perhaps co-regent if your son ascends while still young? Will you be relocated more fully into a temple role, emphasizing your ties to a major deity as a way of safeguarding your status? Examples from the past offer both comfort and warning. Ahmose Nefertari, in the early 18th dynasty, was honored long after her death as a powerful ancestor figure, her memory tied intimately to Theban temples. Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III, appears to have retained influence into the reign of her son Akhenaten, showing how a queen mother could remain central. On the other hand, some royal widows fade from the record quickly, their names surviving only in a few damaged inscriptions. Future scholars will debate why. Personal choice, political sidelining, or gaps in evidence. At night, when you walk through a small colonnaded court on your way back from a private chapel, you pass statues of your husband erected earlier in his reign. In stone, he is forever youthful, strong-jawed, chest broad, stride forward. The real man you left asleep in his chamber now breathes with a faint rasp, his once powerful hands occasionally trembling as he lifts a cup. Both versions of him are true in their own way, the ideal image that kingship demands. and the aging body that time insists upon. You pause for a moment before one statue, reaching out to rest your fingers lightly on its carved arm. The stone is cool under your skin. Above you, on the plinth, a line of hieroglyphs proclaims him beloved of a god, life, prosperity, health, forever. You think of the day when priests will speak these words only in rituals for the dead, when this statue will become part of a tomb or a temple rather than a reflection of a living presence. You also think of yourself and of those who will come after. The palace you inhabit is not a fixed, eternal thing. It changes with each reign, each shift in the balance between crown, temple, and army. You have spent your adult life learning how to read those changes, how to bend without breaking as new centers of power emerge. Now, as the man at the heart of it all slowly weakens, you feel the palace tightening and loosening at once, tightening around his person in protective layers of ritual and care, loosening in the spaces just beyond, where others quietly prepare for what comes next. You return to your rooms, extinguish your lamp, and lie down, listening to the sounds of the sleeping palace. The occasional cough from a guard, the distant splash of water in a fountain, the soft murmur of a nurse soothing a restless child. Somewhere not far away, the king sleeps, his dreams as unknowable as any person's. Around him, an entire apparatus of priests, scribes, soldiers, and family members leans inward, ready to support him, ready whether they admit it or not to carry on once his voice falls silent. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow you will again stand at his side, the visible partner of a power that is quietly redistributing itself in the half-light behind the throne. The day your husband dies is, in some ways, like any other. The sun still rises over the eastern horizon, turning the Nile into a band of light. Servants still carry water jars and sweep courtyards. Somewhere in the palace, children still quarrel over toys. Yet in the inner rooms, where the air has smelled of incense and medicine for weeks, something invisible has shifted. You are there when his breathing changes. You have watched that chest rise and fall through nights of fever and days of weakness, seen the strongest man you knew reduced to careful sips of water and strained words. Now the rhythm slows, pauses, and finally does not resume. The physicians lean in, listening, their hands hovering. The high priest nearby, called in for final prayers, murmurs, formulas, even as his eyes flicker toward the door, already calculating what comes next. You are not permitted to collapse. There is a moment, a single, private heartbeat, when your vision blurs and the room tilts. When you see not the aging king but the younger man you first knew, standing straight in his chariot, laughing in a colonnade, holding a newborn child with awkward tenderness. Then the moment passes. Duties press in, as inexorable as the rivers flow. The body must be prepared. In Egypt, even a commoner's funeral involves ritual. For a king, the process becomes the axis around which the entire state briefly turns. Embalmers from the House of Purification and the House of Embalming arrive with their tools and resins, their knowledge codified in practices that have been refined over centuries. The body is carried to a special place, away from the ordinary bustle of the palace, where professional hands will spend roughly 70 days transforming it into something meant to endure. You do not watch the details. Those belong to a secluded world of bandages, natron drying salts, and careful incisions. Later scholars will study mummies from the New Kingdom and see the results of such work. They will note how techniques change from dynasty to dynasty, and argue about which choices reflect theology, which reflect fashion, and which reflect simple trial and error. For you, the process is less anatomical and more emotional. You send offerings to the embalmers, fine oils, linens of high quality, requests that they show particular care. You visit the chapel attached to their workplace, where a symbolic image of the king's body lies, while priests recite texts meant to reunite his ka and ba, his vital forces, preparing them for the journey ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for the tomb and funerary equipment, long in motion, accelerate. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, or in another chosen necropolis, are often begun early in a reign, their corridors and chambers hacked into the limestone cliffs by teams of skilled workers. By this point, Your husband's tomb may already have corridors painted with scenes from the Amduat or the Book of Gates. Elaborate guides to the hours of the night, showing the sun god traveling through the underworld. Artisans add the final names and images now, checking that the cartouches are correct, that no spell is left incomplete. You are shown parts of this work in progress before the burial. By torchlight, you walk through cool, echoing corridors where the walls glow with color, blues and yellows that mimic the sky and the solar bark, black figures of gods with animal heads, long columns of hieroglyphs marching neatly along plastered surfaces. In the burial chamber, the great stone sarcophagus waits, its lid carved with images of protective deities. Some queens in earlier centuries have had their own names and images painted in royal tombs as companions to the king in eternity. In other cases, wives are mentioned more discreetly or given separate tombs of their own. You inquire, gently, about how you will be represented. The answer you receive is reassuring but also a reminder. Your place here, as in life, is tied to the king's, but your future also extends beyond this single burial. The funeral itself is a carefully orchestrated sequence of rituals. When the mummification is complete, the king's body, wrapped in layers of linen and adorned with amulets, is placed in nested coffins and then in the sarcophagus. Priests, wearing jackal-headed masks of Anubis or leopard skins of Sem priests, perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching an adze to the mummy's face, to statues, to ritual objects, symbolically restoring the senses so the king can eat, speak, see, and breathe in the afterlife. You take part in this as chief mourner. In reliefs from royal tombs and temples, a principal queen is sometimes shown behind or beside the deceased, arms raised, hair loose or shown in a special mourning style, her body gathered into the pose of grief. You enact that role now, wailing at the appropriate moments, scattering dust on your head, tearing at your garment just enough to signal sorrow while still preserving the dignity of your station. It is grief, and it is theatre. The entire court watches you, measuring your composure as much as your tears. The people lining the roads to the necropolis watch too. To them, your public mourning becomes part of a larger narrative. The king has died, but the proper rituals are being performed. The gods are being honored. The succession will be maintained. If you falter too much, it could be read as weakness. If you seem too controlled, it might be blamed on coldness. You walk a line as narrow as the gangplank that once joined the royal barquet to the riverbank. After the coffin is lowered into the tomb and the entrance sealed with plaster and stones, the ceremony shifts. The dead king now belongs to the west, to Osiris, to the realm of ancestors. The living must reassemble themselves under a new center. Somewhere above the sealed corridor, on the open ground near the valley's entrance, priests proclaim the new pharaoh. Perhaps your son, perhaps another chosen heir. Officials shout, life, prosperity, health, with a volume that sounds almost like an order to the universe. Your own titles change even if your name does not. If your son ascends, you become king's mother, a role that can be immensely powerful. In some periods, queen mothers act effectively as co-rulers during the early years of a young king's reign, especially if he is still a child when crowned. They sit in councils, sponsor building projects, and wield influence over appointments. In other times, queen mothers are respected, but kept more at the edges, their advice filtered through male advisors. Historians will argue over specific cases, passing scenes and inscriptions. Was this queen mother truly a regent, or merely honored? Was that depiction of her larger than other figures a sign of genuine authority or artistic convention? If no son of yours takes the throne, your path is less straightforward. You may become a dowager queen, honored as the widow of a former king, but not central to the new king's lineage. Your position then depends heavily on relationships you have cultivated, with temples, with powerful officials, with other branches of the royal family. A misstep can mean quiet marginalization. A well-timed alliance can secure a respected role. In your case, the new king is your son, though not necessarily your eldest. The regimen of power adjusts. Some days, you meet with him and the vizier, discussing matters that blend the domestic and the political. Which women should be brought closer into his personal household? Which temples need his visible favor? How to handle petitions from officials who served his father loyally but whose usefulness may be waning. Other days, you act as a shield, intercepting requests and flattery before they reach him, deciding which ones merit his limited attention. Officials visit your apartments bearing small gifts and carefully phrased compliments. May the king's mother live, beloved of the gods. The support of her son. They know that gaining your goodwill can mean the difference between having their petitions read with interest or set aside unread. At the same time, you know that your son must not be smothered by your presence. A king who seems too dependent on his mother can be criticized behind closed doors by generals and priests who fear a shift in the balance of influence. There is a delicate art in knowing when to speak in council and when to let your son answer without your voice in his ear. Even if you can read the room more quickly than he can, your mourning for your husband does not end with the sealing of his tomb. For years to come, you sponsor offerings at chapels dedicated to him, ensure that his mortuary temple where priests will perform rituals to sustain his car is well supplied. You may even be depicted there, standing behind him in carved reliefs, continuing to support his cult. Ahmose Nefertari, for example, will be venerated as a kind of ancestral goddess in Thebes long after her death, showing how a queen's memory can attach itself to places and rituals. Whether your own memory will stretch so far into the future is unknown, but you act as if it might. Future historians, reading lists of regnal years and king lists on temple walls, will see your husband's name as one segment in a long chain. They will debate whether his reign marks the beginning, middle, or end of some larger trend, the rise or fall of an era. They will see your name, if they see it at all, in smaller signs, on statues, in tomb inscriptions, in scattered references. From those, they will try to reconstruct what your widowhood meant, whether you wielded real power as Queen Mother, whether you were gently set aside, whether your role in a regency was decisive or symbolic. You, walking now through the palace as an older woman, feel the change in every gesture directed toward you. People bow a little more deeply, but also more cautiously. You are honored as the mother of the king and the widow of the last. You are also a potential threat to those who fear too much continuity of influence from one reign to the next. At night, your chamber is quieter than it once was. No longer do you listen for your husband's breathing or for the shuffle of physicians' feet. Instead, you hear the distant sounds of your son's reign beginning, the scratch of a scribe's pen in his audience hall, the clink of new foundation deposits being prepared for his building projects, the muffled chanting of priests invoking his names alongside those of the gods. You lie under your linen sheets and think of the path that has brought you here. From a noble girl on a river estate, to a pharaoh's wife in a palace full of politics, to a queen mother whose influence now moves differently, less openly, but still real. Widowhood has given you a new kind of visibility and a new set of dangers. You move more slowly, perhaps, but your eyes are sharper than ever, watching as another circle of years begins to turn around a new center. As your son's reign settles into its own pattern, another horizon slowly comes into view, not the line of cliffs that hides the Valley of the Kings, but the quieter boundary of your own life. You have walked beside a king, given birth to another, guided a palace through lean years and festival days. Now, you begin to think more often of the place where your body will one day rest, and of the traces you will leave for those who come after. You have known since early in your queenship that some preparations must begin long before they are needed. Just as kings start their tombs soon after accession, great royal wives often plan their own burial places while they are still active at court. In some dynasties, queens are buried in the Valley of the Queens, Ta Set Neferu, the place of beauty, with its honeycomb of rock-cut tombs on the west bank opposite Thebes. In others, they lie in smaller tombs near the king's mortuary temple or in separate chapels of their own. Your chosen site lies in that western desert, in a small wadi where the sun strikes the cliffs in the late afternoon, turning the pale stone golden. When you visit, the heat presses against your skin, but the tomb itself is cool. Its entrance is modest compared to royal monuments, yet carefully placed so that floodwaters will not reach it, and so that it can be found by those who must tend your cult in the years after your death. Inside, artisans from the same village that serves the king's tombs, skilled men from a place like Deir el-Medina, have been at work for years. They carve smooth walls, straight and true, then cover them with fine plaster ready for paint. When you come to inspect, they set down their pallets and stand respectfully aside, the smell of pigment dust and damp plaster rising around you. On one wall, you see yourself sketched in red guidelines, an outline of a woman in a long sheath dress, arms raised in adoration before a god. The painter has not yet filled in the colors, but you can already recognize the curve of your shoulders, the tilt of your head. On another wall, a procession of deities waits to be properly clothed in blue, green, and gold. Osiris, Lord of the Dead; Hathor, welcoming the justified; Anubis, watcher over mummification; and others whose names you have spoken in prayers for decades. You speak with the chief draftsman about the scenes to be included. In some queenly tombs of the New Kingdom, like the famous resting place of Nefertari, beloved wife of Ramesses II, walls are covered with chapters from what modern scholars call the Book of the Dead, spells and hymns meant to guide the deceased through the challenges of the afterlife. You want something similar, images of you playing senet under the gaze of gods, of you breathing in the sweet air of the field of reeds, of you sailing in a solar bark behind Ra. The draftsman unrolls a sheet of papyrus covered in columns of hieroglyphs. These are excerpts from those spells, chosen and arranged with care. He explains in measured tones which ones ward off snakes and crocodiles in the underworld, which allow the heart not to testify against you, which open gates guarded by fearsome beings with names that twist in the mouth. You nod, knowing that your actual judgment will not be won by magic words alone, but comforted by the tradition. Generations of Egyptians, from simple artisans to kings, have relied on these texts as a kind of map. In one chamber, you plan a scene that is as much about memory as it is about theology. You will be shown seated, receiving offerings from your children, and perhaps from their children, your name spoken by priests as they present loaves, jars of beer, cuts of meat, and bouquets of lotus flowers. The draftsman suggests adding a small table of hieroglyphs listing the endowments you have assigned to support this cult: fields in such and such district, a share of grain from a particular estate, a group of servants whose duties will include bringing offerings on specific festival days. These details are not just vanity. In Egypt, to speak a name is to keep a person alive. If your funerary cult has resources to endure land, staff, a place in the calendar of rituals, your memory stands a better chance of surviving the slow erosion of time. If, however, endowments are allowed to be swallowed by other estates, or if political shifts deprive your cult of support, your chapel may fall silent sooner than you would like. Historians in distant ages will read such offering lists and argue about how long queenly cults remained active, which women continued to be venerated, and which slipped into obscurity. You also oversee preparations for the objects that will accompany you. In a storeroom near the palace, carpenters and goldsmiths work on your coffins and funerary furniture. Wooden coffins are shaped, smoothed, coated with gesso, and then painted with bands of inscriptions and protective symbols. If you are fortunate, they will bear inlaid glass or semi-precious stones, flashes of color that catch torchlight in the dark of the tomb. Nested within one another, they will cradle your mummified body in layers of protection. Nearby, artisans carve shabti figures, small servant statues, meant to work for you in the next world. Each holds a tiny hoe and basket, ready, according to their inscriptions, to answer if you are called to perform labor in the fields of reeds. The number of these figures can be large for a person of your rank. Some burials include hundreds, along with overseer shabtis to manage them. You run your fingers lightly over the hieroglyphs on one unfinished figure's torso, feeling the raised promise: if I am called, here I am. Textile workers prepare linens not only for your eventual wrappings, but also for daily offerings in your chapel. Potters shape canopic jars to hold your internal organs. their lids molded into protective deities, often the four sons of Horus. A scribe checks that the names of each organ and god are correctly placed. Such details matter, for in the logic of your religion, misplacement could cause confusion or vulnerability in the afterlife. Priests help you choose which titles to emphasize on your sarcophagus and tomb walls. Great royal wife will of course appear, as will king's mother if your son rules when you die. Perhaps you also carry temple titles God's wife, singer of a moon, or similar linking you to specific cults. The order and prominence of these epithets are not accidental. They shape how future generations, and the gods themselves, will understand your identity. Later scholars will debate how much political messaging is hidden in these choices, reading queenly tombs as documents of power as well as piety. In quieter moments, sitting in your private chapel, with a small oil lamp flickering near a statue of a goddess, you think about what parts of your real life will never make it onto tomb walls. The arguments in the harem, the nights of anxiety over your children's safety, the whispers of conspiracy, none of that will appear in painted scenes of you elegantly offering incense to Osiris. The tomb will show an ordered, serene version of your existence. You in fine linen, hair perfect, forever young, forever welcomed by gods. Some future historians will caution their students not to take these images too literally. Tombs show ideals, they will say. They show how the dead wanted to be seen, not necessarily how they lived. Others will point out small details, calloused feet, drawn slightly more realistically, a hint of wrinkles, a scene of you playing a board game, or inhaling the scent of a lotus as clues that real pleasures and habits sometimes slipped in. You find a certain comfort in this selectivity. It is enough that the gods and your own heart know the full story. The tomb needs only to preserve the outline, the way a painter's sketch preserves the essence of a face without every line of worry. You choose scenes that mean something to you. A depiction of the palace garden where you often walked at dusk, subtly transformed into the eternal gardens of the West. An image of you embracing a favored daughter under the approving gaze of Hathor. A scene of you offering a tiny figure of Maat, the principle of truth and order to a god, as if reminding the divine world that you tried, in your own limited way, to support it. As the years pass, you visit the tomb less often, not because you care for it less, but because your steps have grown slower, your days more crowded, with duties as Queen Mother. The artisans need less guidance now. They know the style, the colors, the sequence. When you do go, escorted by a small retinue, you notice how much has been completed. Walls once bare now shine with color. Spells once only ink on papyrus are now carved and painted in permanent form. Standing there, in the cool, painted silence, you feel time fold strangely. The tomb shows you, as you want to be remembered, standing straight, skin smooth, forever in the prime of life. Your actual body, wrapped in linen and lean with age, stands before that image like a future ghost. You are both of these women at once, and neither completely. You reach out and touch your painted hand on the wall, fingers hovering just short of the pigment so as not to damage it. The torchlight makes the colors flutter slightly, as if the painted you were breathing. You think of how, centuries from now, if the tomb is not robbed or reused, strangers might step into this chamber and see this same scene by another light, lamps of a different age, eyes trained by different questions. They will speak languages you cannot imagine, argue about dates and dynasties, and give you labels you never used for yourself. They will not know the sound of your voice or the exact shade of your laughter, but they will know your name because you have written it here. When you leave the tomb and step back into the harsh sunlight of the western desert, the cliffs loom above you, dotted with holes where other lives have been folded away. Kings, queens, princes, court officials, all gathered in the rock, their carefully prepared resting places, layered like pages in a book. You are adding your own page, your own chapter in a story that will outlast the palace gossip, the partisan struggles, the fragile certainties of a single reign. As your entourage leads you back toward the river, sand crunching softly under sandals, you feel oddly lighter. Preparations for your afterlife do not erase the unknown, but they give it a structure, a tomb, a set of texts, a pattern of offerings. You have shaped, as best you can, how your face and your titles will look when the living descend with lamps and read your walls. The rest, what gods you will meet, what judgment you will face, how long your name will survive, is beyond even the reach of a pharaoh's wife. For now, the sun is warm on your shoulders, the river ahead glitters, and the palace which holds your memories, your children, your remaining work, waits on the green strip between desert and water. You turn toward it, knowing that part of you is already inscribed in stone, waiting quietly in the west for the day when you join it. You do not feel the moment your own heart stops in any way you can put into words. For you, it is more like falling asleep in a room you know too well. The familiar scent of oils on your skin, the murmur of priests reciting formulas, the soft press of linen against your cheeks. Then, nothing the living would recognize, only the rituals that continue around your still body. Hands arranging wrappings, voices calling on gods whose images you have traced with your eyes for decades. The embalming follows the pattern you oversaw for your husband. The drying salts of natron, the careful anointing, the placing of amulets between layers of cloth. Your face is covered, yet your names are spoken over and over, drawn in ink on bandages, carved on your coffins, painted on the walls waiting in the western hills. When at last you are carried along the river to your tomb, the procession looks like others you have watched from the outside. Mourners, musicians, priests, standard-bearers, the measured grief of an elite funeral. You pass under the doorway you chose years ago, into the cool carved rooms where your painted self has been waiting. Lamps flicker, throwing your own image into motion on the walls. You embracing Hathor, you standing behind Osiris, you receiving offerings from children who now walk in the procession, their faces more lined than in the scenes. The opening of the mouth is performed, the last prayers spoken, the sarcophagus sealed. Stones close the entrance, and you are left in the careful dark. Time, for you, is no longer counted in regnal years. It becomes something else, a slow settling of dust, the drying of paint, the faint creaking of wood as coffins adjust to the silence. Above your tomb, the palace changes. Your son rules, then his son, then other kings whose names you never heard in life. Temples gain and lose favor. High priests rise like secondary sons, especially in Thebes, where the god Ammon's clergy will in some periods wield authority almost equal to the crown. In the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, the rock fills with more burials. New corridors are cut, new scenes painted. Some later kings, under pressure from foreign invasions and internal strain, command fewer resources for their tombs. Others still insist on full splendor, even as the country's reach shrinks. Eventually, in the Third Intermediate Period, priests worried about tomb robbers will open old royal burials, remove the mummies, rewrap them, and hide them in secret caches places, like the Great Collective Tomb at Deir el-Bahri that modern archaeologists will one day call DB 320, or in another king's tomb, such as KV 35. Your own resting place might be disturbed, your body moved, or your funerary goods taken. Or, if you were less prominent, you might lie undisturbed longer, simply because robbers did not think you worth the risk. Centuries pass in that layered way Egyptian history has. Libyan chiefs becoming kings, Nubian rulers conquering and then being driven back, Assyrians briefly storming through, Persians stamping their names on stelae, and, much later still, Macedonian Greeks establishing a dynasty that will one day give Egypt a queen whose name nearly everyone in the modern world will know, Cleopatra VII. Historians of those later times will look back at your age, the New Kingdom, as a kind of golden era, an empire of great temples and famous kings like Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Seti I, Ramesses II. Your own name will not be in every schoolbook. It might appear only in specialist articles, or on the labels of museum cases noting great royal wife of. followed by a king's more familiar titles. Yet you are part of the pattern that made those more famous figures possible. Without women like you, wives who bore children, mediated between court and temple, stood in processions that reassured the people, those reigns would have felt very different from the inside. Later scholars, aware of how the record has favored male names, will argue about how much agency royal wives actually had. Some will point to queenly regents, to the judicial papyri from the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, to the prominent images of women like Nefertari and Tiye, and suggest that the influence of royal wives ran deep. Others will caution that for every famous queen, there were many wives whose lives remain largely invisible, their choices filtered through the needs of royal ideology. Your own tomb, if it survives long enough, enters this conversation. Perhaps, in a much later age, local villagers will stumble upon its entrance while cutting stone or herding goats. Word will spread of painted rooms in the hills. In the 19th century, of a distant calendar, teams of European and Egyptian excavators working under officials, inspired in part by the earlier French expedition and the decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion, will pry open sealed doors and descend with candles and notebooks. They will stand where you once stood by torchlight and see your painted figure in their own flickering glow. They will copy your name into their journals, not perfectly at first, but more accurately as the study of your language advances. Some of your possessions, the ones still there, will travel further than you ever did in life, to museums in Cairo, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in places you never knew existed. Behind glass, your Shabti figures will stand in silent rows. Your jewelry will catch electric light instead of lamplight. Your coffin fragments will be set up for visitors who whisper and read the labels in languages you never heard. Those visitors will bring their own stories with them. Novels and films that have painted Egyptian queens as dangerous seductresses, as tragic lovers, as schemers or saints, standing before your image. They may project some of those tales onto you. Their minds might jump from your carefully painted profile to Cleopatra reclining on a barge, or Nefertiti's famous bust, gazing serenely in a distant museum. You become, in their eyes, part of a blur called the Pharaoh's Wives, rich with fantasy and often thin on detail. Yet in reading the small printed lines under your name, some of them will glimpse something closer to the reality you lived. Mentions of your titles, the era you lived in, the kings you knew, the rituals you performed. They may learn about the strike at Deir el-Medina, about the harem conspiracy, about the shifting power of high priests, about how royal tombs were reused and mummies hidden. They will hear that historians still argue over just how much power women like you wielded, that your world was not just golden jewelry and eyeliner, but also grain accounts, diplomacy, and the constant negotiation between visibility and safety. In that way, your life continues to move, sparking curiosity in strangers, fueling debates in lecture halls, inspiring artists and storytellers who try, in different media, to imagine themselves into your sandals. Some get details wrong, some invent more than they should, others approach more carefully, acknowledging where the evidence ends and speculation begins, trying to give you back a voice without pretending it can be fully recovered. And now, in this quiet moment, you are being remembered again, not by priests in a mortuary chapel or by scholars in a conference, but by someone lying in a bed far from the Nile, listening in the dark. Your world, the courtyards and hyperstyle halls, the painted tombs and incense-heavy festivals, the rivalries and risks of a palace full of politics, has crossed thousands of years to become a soft story in the present, something to fall asleep to. For all the grandeur that surrounded you, your deepest experiences were not entirely foreign. The weight of responsibility, the ache of love for your children, the anxiety of uncertain years, the bittersweet work of preparing to say goodbye. Those are threads that run through lives in every age. Historians can argue about titles and timelines, but in the end, what reaches across the centuries is simpler. The sense of a person navigating power and vulnerability at the same time, doing the best she can in a world whose currents are larger than she is. And so you remain, halfway between history and myth. Not a single famous name, perhaps, but one of the many women whose lives made the institution of Pharaoh possible, whose faces flicker in paint and stone, whose stories can only be told in careful, partial reconstruction, and whose quiet courage deserves, from time to time, to be remembered in the soft half-light before sleep. Now the palace grows very still in your mind. The painted walls of your tomb fade to a gentle dusk, the bright colours softening, as if the oil lamps have been lowered. The corridors that once echoed with footsteps and ritual chants are empty now, holding only cool air and the slow settling of centuries. Above ground, the great temples stand in the moonlight, their pylons and obelisks casting long shadows over the quiet riverbank. The city's streets, once filled with carts and donkeys and markets, are emptying under the same wide sky that arches over you now. You let the images drift further away, the rustle of linen skirts in palace courtyards, the glitter of gold collars, the murmur of envoys reading clay tablets, the laughter and tension in the women's house, the distant drums of festivals. They all soften into something like the distant sound of waves, present but no longer sharp. The worries that once seemed enormous, pour floods, rivalries, succession, conspiracies whispered behind lattice screens belong firmly to that earlier world, a world that has already turned to dust and inscription. Here, in your own room, the light is dimmer, gentler. Perhaps the glow of a small lamp, or the blue-white square of a screen fading as your eyes grow heavy. Your own walls are quieter than any palace, your ceiling closer than any painted sky in a tomb. You are not being watched by scribes and priests. You are simply lying there, wrapped in whatever blankets you chose, listening to your own breath slow in your chest. Outside your window, whatever city or countryside you live in has its own faint sounds, cars passing, a dog barking once and then falling silent, a late voice drifting up from the street, or just the hush of night holding everything in place. Far beyond that, beyond clouds and contrails and satellites, the same stars that look down on Thebes, on Pi-Ramesses, on the Valley of the Queens, still shine. They have seen pharaohs come and go, kingdoms rise and fall, names carved deep and then forgotten. They are in no hurry. You can let your thoughts follow them upward, if you like, imagining all the centuries stacked between you and that queen in her stone chamber, the scribes and builders, the farmers and soldiers, the priests and children, the scholars and travellers and excavators, and finally yourself, listening to it all turn into a story. None of their anxieties can touch you now. The politics that once filled those palaces with tension are as distant and harmless as clouds reflected in a river. All that remains for you, in this moment, is the softness of your pillow, the familiar weight of your own body easing into the mattress, the gentle rise and fall of your breathing. History has closed its heavy doors for the night. The tombs, the courts, the festivals have all faded into a comfortable blur. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed, with nothing you must do except rest. You can let your eyes close fully, if they have not already, and allow the last remnants of palace light to ebb away, until only a quiet darkness remains like the inside of a cool stone chamber, but filled not with fear, only with peace. Somewhere far away, the Nile still glides through memory, the temples still glow with imagined torchlight, and the queens and kings of long ago lie undisturbed. Here, you have the simple, precious luxury they no longer need. Another night to sleep, another chance to dream, and as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams.